Beneath the surface of recorded history lies a sequence of moments that refuse to stay fixed, encounters where time bends, folds, and turns back upon itself. Across deserts, skies, cities and seas, witnesses have described impossible experiences, planes that vanish and return unchanged, roads that open into other eras, and signals that reach across centuries as if the future were listening. On this journey through the world's most perplexing temporal mysteries, the investigation follows those moments suspended between fact and impossibility, a descent into true accounts of time warps, unexplained anomalies, and the people who briefly stepped outside the world's clockwork order. From lost expeditions to scientific experiments gone astray, each story reveals another fracture in our understanding of time itself. The search is not for proof, but for the quiet evidence that something vast and unseen still shapes the edges of every moment we call the present. The pilot who saw his future self mid-flight. Above the jagged spines of the Rocky Mountains, the cockpit of Flight 217 hummed with the low, constant vibration of twin turboprops. Captain Jonathan Harker, a veteran of 20 years in commercial aviation, adjusted the altitude slightly to avoid an oncoming patch of turbulence, the mountains rising like frozen waves of stone beneath him. The morning light was sharp against the frost-tipped peaks, scattering across the expanse of sky and snow. It was a routine flight from Denver to Salt Lake City, one he had completed dozens of times, and yet as he scanned the horizon, he noticed something that made him tighten his grip on the yoke. For a brief moment, just beyond the thin veil of clouds, he thought he saw another aircraft, a small private plane glinting in the sun. Its position seemed impossible. It mirrored his own trajectory almost perfectly, yet there was no corresponding radar contact on the flight instruments. But then the impossible occurred. The shape of the pilot inside the distant aircraft was unmistakably familiar. The face, the posture, even the way the hands rested on the controls, it was him. Only older, perhaps 15 or 20 years his senior, with greyer hair and eyes that carried the weight of decades yet to come. The image was fleeting, dissolving as quickly as it appeared, leaving Harker questioning whether he'd glimpsed a reflection of the future or had momentarily lost touch with the present. Flight records and aviation logs offer few precedents for what Harker experienced, though there are anecdotal reports from other pilots of similar phenomena. In 1979, a private pilot over the Nevada desert described seeing a duplicate of his own aircraft, maintaining impossible maneuvers in the same airspace without violating known aerodynamics. The US Federal Aviation Administration investigated the incident, noting that no other plane had been registered in the area, and radar archives remained inconclusive. Harker's case differed in that it was not another aircraft in the ordinary sense, but a temporal reflection, an overlay of his own future self against the present sky, a phenomenon that eluded conventional understanding of aviation physics. The science of aviation is precise and meticulous, built upon the predictability of aerodynamics, weather patterns, and navigational charts. Yet Harker had been flying long enough to recognize anomalies that did not belong. The air temperature at 18,000 feet, the airspeed and the wind drift were all consistent with meteorological forecasts. Nothing in the environment suggested mirages, refraction, or visual distortion. Studies in atmospheric optics, such as the effects of temperature inversion or high-altitude ice crystals, can create illusions of distant objects or duplications of images, but they rarely produce the specificity of a human figure perfectly mimicking one's own gestures. Harker could not find an explanation within radar anomalies, visual perception research, or the thousands of flights he had logged. Several investigators have suggested that reports like Harker's may involve micro-time slips, a term describing brief distortions in the subjective perception of temporal flow. Research on time perception indicates that the human brain can misinterpret milliseconds of sensory input under stress or monotony, but Harker's sighting lasted several seconds and felt beyond normal perceptual error. Pilots describe a phenomenon called situational awareness, an almost instinctive processing of environmental data that becomes second nature after thousands of flight hours. For Harker, his situational awareness amplified the dissonance of seeing his own self, performing exactly the motions he would make decades hence in a plane that should not have existed in that moment. The flight continued, and Harker found himself glancing repeatedly at the spot where the vision had appeared, as though a second glimpse might confirm or disprove the experience. After 20 minutes, the sensation receded, leaving only the low hum of the engines and the faint trace of unease in his chest. When he landed in Salt Lake City, he filed a routine post-flight report noting minor turbulence and weather conditions, but did not include the sighting, aware that any mention of the impossible would likely invite ridicule. Long-haul pilots report seeing flashes of other aircraft, ghostly figures, or premonitions, often dismissed as cognitive fatigue. Yet Harker had flown only a few hours that morning, with clear skies and minimal stress, and his colleagues described him as having exemplary judgment and attention. There was no reason to attribute the vision to exhaustion, misjudgment, or hallucination. For Harker, the incident remained as vivid as the day he first saw the mountain peak slicing through sunlight and the impossible figure flying alongside him. Historical records of temporal anomalies among aviators are sparse but intriguing. In 1948, a commercial flight over the Arizona desert reportedly lost several minutes inexplicably, with passengers describing glimpses of towns that no longer existed. Pilots in the 1950s recounted ghost aircraft, appearing briefly in radar screens and vanishing without a trace. These accounts, preserved in personal logs and aviation newsletters, share the commonality of uncertainty, leaving researchers to debate whether such experiences represent perceptual distortions, psychological phenomena, or rare physical occurrences beyond current scientific explanation. Harker's sighting fits this pattern, grounded in observation and technical awareness, yet untethered from conventional causality. The mystery deepens when considering the implications of the vision. If Harker truly glimpsed a future self, then the airspace itself became a stage for intersecting temporal streams, a brief window in which the present and the future overlapped. The image of himself flying, older yet performing familiar motions, challenges assumptions of linear progression, suggesting that time might not be as fixed as instruments and records imply. Perhaps it was a premonition, perhaps an actual slice of a temporal anomaly, or perhaps an inexplicable confluence of circumstances that only the mind can frame in the language of experience. Harker returned to the cockpit several weeks later, compelled to fly the same route under similar conditions, hoping for a recurrence. The mountains were as jagged and cold as ever, the sunlight scattering over the frost, and the engines hummed with that familiar mechanical certainty. Yet nothing appeared beyond the clouds, no future self, no impossible duplicate, only the endless expanse of sky and snow. He filed a personal note in his flight log, describing the event with precision and restraint, leaving the question unresolved for anyone who might find the report decades later. Even now, pilots who have heard Harker's account debate the possibility. Some insist it was a psychological anomaly, others suggest a temporal displacement or glimpse of parallel realities. Harker himself remained certain that he saw what he saw, a future version of himself flying beside him, distant yet intimately familiar, performing each action exactly as he would, years from that day. The moment left him with the unsettling realization that the horizon is not only a boundary of space, but also, perhaps, a boundary of time, and somewhere beyond the clouds a figure waits to be recognized. Moberly-Jourdain Incident, Versailles, 1901. On a quiet morning in August 1901, Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain departed the busy streets of Versailles, stepping into the Petit Trianon gardens with their sketchbooks in hand. The small chateau, commissioned for Madame de Pompadour and later closely associated with Marie Antoinette, rose from the greenery like a delicate jewel of stone and symmetry. Sunlight spilled over the gravel paths, igniting fountains and gilded statues, while the faint scent of roses and freshly mown grass filled the air. The two women, both trained academics with rigorous observational skills, had planned this excursion as a scholarly study, to capture geometry, proportion, and the artistry of the gardens. But the morning was unlike any they had prepared for, carrying a subtle, almost imperceptible tension that quickened their awareness of every rustle, shadow, and reflection. As they followed the winding paths around the Petit Trianon, the hum of modern Versailles faded, replaced by the quiet trickle of fountains and the delicate tapping of their boots on gravel. Ahead, they glimpsed figures whose attire seemed wholly misplaced. Men in frock coats and tricorn-like hats, women in pale silk dresses and lace caps that belonged to a century prior. The gestures were natural, unforced, pausing at sundials, adjusting parasols, or bending to gather flowers in carefully arranged gardens. Moberly and Jourdain paused, uncertain whether they had stumbled upon a reenactment or perhaps a chance group of costume-dressed visitors, but the isolation of the grounds, the muted light, and the absence of any modern sound or scent suggested otherwise. Their eyes traced every detail: the cut of a coat, the shimmer of silk, the height of hedges, the angle of fountains, elements that should have been familiar yet appeared frozen in a different era. Figures moved methodically, as if choreographed by an invisible rhythm. One man paused to consult a rolled parchment, examining the sundial as though it measured not hours but the precise cadence of another century. A young woman gathered fruit into a wicker basket, her hands delicate, her attention absorbed in a task that felt ritualistic. Birds sang, fountains gurgled, and yet the scene held an otherworldly silence, as though the air itself separated this moment from 1901. Moberly and Jourdain noted that the stone surfaces and vegetation reflected light in subtle ways described only in 18th century sketches. Shadows fell at angles inconsistent with the rising sun, and the sound of footsteps echoed without resonance, as if carried from another time. The gardens themselves had borne witness to the turbulence of history. Louis XVI's court had meticulously maintained every flowerbed and pathway, creating a space both private and emblematic of royal refinement. Marie Antoinette had walked these very alleys, entertaining guests, musicians, and confidants in a world rigidly ordered yet intimately human. The Petit Trianon's architecture, with its delicately balanced symmetry, small ornamental pavilions, and sculpted statuary, had survived centuries of political upheaval and neglect. Every column, balustrade, and carved fountain seemed to convey both permanence and fragility, a fitting backdrop for a day that blurred the lines between past and present. A sense of unease pressed upon the women as the anomalies intensified. Gravel paths seemed to extend and contract, statues shifted subtly when viewed from different angles, and fountains appeared to ripple with emotion they could not reconcile. The air carried scents and sounds that belonged to no recorded moment: the smoke of a distant kitchen, the laughter of children in period dress, the faint clatter of horse-drawn carriages over cobblestones now long removed. Their scholarly instinct compelled them to note every inconsistency, sketching fountains, chairs, and flower arrangements, yet no pen or paper could fully contain the dissonance between observation and expectation. Every line of ink felt inadequate against the weight of the unexplainable. Moberly and Jourdain attempted to rationalize their perceptions. Perhaps they had glimpsed a reenactment, a dreamlike projection, or a collective hallucination influenced by fatigue or imagination. Yet both women were known for their precision, critical thought, and disciplined attention to detail. Neither had a history of psychological disturbance, and both later insisted that their memories were remarkably vivid, retaining the tiniest particulars of attire, gestures, and environmental details. The fidelity of their recollections, cross-checked with historical engravings and court records, demonstrates that they had observed elements of Versailles that had changed or been restored in the decades after their visit. Years later, their notes and recollections were carefully compiled into the book An Adventure, published under pseudonyms to protect their reputations. The work described in meticulous detail the paths taken, the individuals encountered, and the uncanny accuracy of objects and clothing. Scholars and historians have since analysed the accounts, weighing the possibility of selective memory, unconscious reconstruction, or psychological projection against the precise correspondence of architectural and horticultural features. Some drawings produced by Moberly and Jourdain were found to align with documented restorations and historical illustrations, lending an air of credibility to what many might otherwise dismiss as mere anecdote. Even after a century of debate, the mystery endures. Psychologists consider the experience a striking example of time-slip phenomena, while historians continue to probe its factual intersections with Versailles' preserved architecture. Each theory, whether skeptical or speculative, fails to fully reconcile the sensory richness, temporal displacement, and precise visual details reported by the two women. The Petit Trianon, serene yet steeped in layered history, offered them a doorway into a temporal ambiguity that remained inaccessible to ordinary perception. Their walk that day became both a historical study and an unanswerable puzzle, a moment suspended between scholarship and inexplicable experience. Though decades have passed, the gardens retain an echo of that anomaly. The gravel paths, fountains and hedges continue to witness visitors, scholars and tourists unaware of the precise moment when time may fold upon itself. Shadows lengthen, sunlight shifts, and a breeze moves through the roses in a pattern almost imperceptible to the casual observer, hinting at continuity beyond immediate comprehension. Moberly and Jourdain's experience endures as a testament to the layers of history, the fragility of perception, and the possibility that time is neither wholly linear nor entirely bound by memory. Amid the sculpted avenues of the Petit Trianon, a fragment of the past lingers, poised to touch a present too unaware to perceive it. Opera Faster-Than-Light Neutrino Anomaly, CERN 2011. Deep beneath the Italian Apennines, the Gran Sasso Laboratory sprawled through tunnels carved into solid rock, a hidden complex designed to shield experiments from cosmic radiation and external interference. Within these subterranean halls, detectors stood silent and precise, prepared to measure the passage of some of the universe's most elusive particles, neutrinos. Nearly massless and travelling mostly unimpeded through matter, neutrinos offered physicists an unparalleled glimpse into the fundamental nature of reality. In 2011, one such experiment, the Oscillation Project with Emulsion Tracking Apparatus, or OPERA, would unexpectedly challenge the assumed limits of the cosmos, suggesting a speed that could surpass even light itself. A beam of neutrinos, invisible to the naked eye, was projected from CERN's accelerator complex near Geneva, spanning a distance of 730 kilometers to Gran Sasso. This setup relied on meticulously synchronized atomic clocks, precise GPS signals, and a labyrinth of optical fibers transmitting timing data between laboratories. Detectors buried deep underground, shielded from cosmic rays by over a kilometer of rock, awaited the faintest interactions. Each neutrino collision was logged with microsecond precision, its timestamp etched into the electronic memory of the observatory. The scientists involved knew that even a single miscalculation could compromise the experiment. The system was a delicate orchestration of physics, engineering, and mathematics, intended to reaffirm the unyielding rule that nothing travels faster than light. The sensors and cables beneath the surface formed a complex network, a delicate system in which every component depended on the exact alignment of dozens of subsystems. The OPERA experiment relied on a chain of synchronization that included GPS satellites orbiting the Earth, atomic clocks accurate to billionths of a second, and photodetectors capable of recording events that lasted mere nanoseconds. Even a minor thermal fluctuation or mechanical shift in the rock could subtly alter the alignment of instruments, highlighting the sheer difficulty of capturing neutrino interactions with absolute certainty. Engineers meticulously monitored temperature, humidity, and electromagnetic interference, documenting every adjustment. Yet even with all these controls, the brief appearance of a faster-than-light anomaly hinted at how fragile the interface between measurement and reality can be. When initial results were analysed, data streams revealed something the physicists could scarcely believe. Across multiple measurements, neutrinos appeared to arrive at Gran Sasso approximately 60 nanoseconds earlier than the time light would require to traverse the same distance. At first, researchers suspected an error, perhaps a misaligned clock, a delayed signal, or a miscalibrated detector. Yet the discrepancy persisted through repeated measurements, and independent cross-checks confirmed the anomaly. For a moment, the numerical evidence suggested a violation of Einstein's theory of relativity, the very foundation upon which modern physics rests. Teams of scientists worked around the clock to eliminate every possible source of error. Fiber optic cables were replaced, GPS systems recalibrated, and timing equipment scrutinized. Conferences were convened, emails circulated, and journals monitored the unfolding story with tense interest. Some physicists speculated on highly improbable scenarios, quantum tunneling effects, higher dimensional shortcuts, or local temporal distortions caused by unknown environmental factors. Others remained cautious, reminding colleagues that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that even the smallest misalignment in instrumentation could yield seemingly impossible results. The underground halls, normally humming with quiet certainty, now echoed with a tension rarely experienced in scientific practice. The anomaly captured international attention, Popular media headlines hinted at faster-than-light travel, sparking debates far beyond physics circles. Yet within the labs, the focus remained methodical and restrained. Eliminate error, repeat experiments, document everything. Scientists travelled between Geneva and Gran Sasso to verify the beam's path, recalibrate detectors, and cross-reference GPS data with atomic clocks housed in secure facilities. Every pulse of the neutrino beam was examined, every digital timestamp checked and rechecked. The community collectively recognized the stakes. If these results were valid, the rules of causality, time, and space might need reconsideration. Despite the growing tension, the opera experiment embodied the precision and ingenuity of modern physics. The detectors, composed of scintillator strips and emulsion plates, were designed to capture the faintest glimmers of interaction. Each neutrino's brief passage produced data that could survive for analysis, but could never be observed directly. Scientists immersed themselves in statistical analyses, applying models to understand variance, propagation delays, and environmental noise. Every number, every microsecond, was scrutinized in pursuit of understanding, an unflinching commitment to truth in a situation that seemed to flirt with the impossible. Eventually, the source of the discrepancy was identified. A loose fiber optic cable had introduced a subtle but critical timing error. Once corrected, neutrinos conformed to the expected speed, and relativity remained intact. Yet even with the resolution, the episode left a lasting impression. For hours, the instruments had suggested that particles could outpace light, revealing how closely humanity approaches the edges of the known universe without ever fully seeing them. The anomaly became a lesson in humility, precision, and the unknowable possibilities that lie just beyond the reach of even our most sophisticated instruments. The opera episode also inspired broader reflection. Physicists, philosophers, and enthusiasts alike contemplated the delicate boundary between measurement and reality, between what can be verified and what can only be imagined. The tension between expectation and observation, between theory and evidence, is the crucible in which scientific understanding is forged. For a brief window, numbers on a screen whispered of a universe where the speed of light might not be absolute, where temporal boundaries could flex and bend, and where the ordinary assumptions of cause and effect felt momentarily suspended. Even after the anomaly was explained, the data retained a haunting quality. Each pulse of neutrinos carried the echo of that improbable measurement, a reminder of the universe's capacity to surprise, to challenge, and to hint at mysteries beyond comprehension. The tunnels of Gran Sasso, once merely functional, seemed charged with the memory of a moment when the familiar laws of physics wavered. For those who had monitored the experiment, the sensation of holding a fleeting glimpse of the impossible endured, a quiet and persistent curiosity that lingered long after the cables were secured and the calculations verified. In the streams of invisible particles, the universe speaks softly of truths that no instrument or clock can fully capture. Pioneer anomaly, deep space probes. In the vast emptiness beyond Saturn, two metallic emissaries of humanity drifted steadily into the dark. Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11, launched in 1972 and 1973, were the first spacecraft to traverse the asteroid belt and venture into the outer solar system. Their mission was both practical and symbolic: to map planetary atmospheres, capture close-up images of Jupiter and Saturn, and carry a message of Earth to whatever future explorers might find them. Each probe was a marvel of engineering, weighing just over 250 kilograms and equipped with instruments designed to survive extreme conditions, while a small golden plaque depicted the location of our planet and its inhabitants. A message frozen in time carried silently across billions of kilometers. Signals from the spacecraft traveled slowly but reliably, covering the immense distance between the probes and Earth. Scientists monitored the radio telemetry and Doppler shifts with extreme precision, reconstructing the spacecraft's trajectories using complex models of planetary motion and gravity. Every minor variation in velocity or course was recorded and compared against expected values. For years, the data aligned with predictions, confirming the reliability of Newtonian physics and Einstein's relativistic corrections. But as the probes moved farther from the Sun, an unexpected pattern began to emerge. A slight, persistent acceleration toward the inner solar system, small in magnitude but unmistakable. Repeated calculations revealed a subtle, almost ghostly tug, as if an unseen hand was reaching across space. This acceleration, roughly 8.74 x 10 to 10 meters per second squared, was too small to notice in casual observation but statistically significant in long-term monitoring. Initially, mission analysts suspected systematic error, a miscalibrated antenna, flawed telemetry, or data processing issues. Yet the discrepancy persisted through multiple independent teams, time periods, and methods of analysis. Even as the probes moved into interstellar space, the anomaly continued, imperceptible to the eye but glaring in the precision of mathematics. The Pioneer spacecraft themselves were deceptively simple in design, yet their structure played a role in the anomaly. Each probe emitted heat from its radioisotope thermoelectric generators, producing thermal photons that, reflecting unevenly off the spacecraft, could subtly alter its motion. Engineers meticulously modelled this effect, accounting for geometry, material properties, and decades of accumulated energy output. The task was formidable. Even the smallest deviation in emissivity or surface reflection could account for measurable differences in acceleration. The analysis required combing through archival records of manufacturing tolerances, power output decay, and thruster usage logs, emphasizing the scale of human effort invested in understanding a phenomenon so tiny that it could be missed entirely without extreme diligence. Teams of physicists and engineers pored over the data for years, combining observations with theoretical models. Gravitational influences from distant planets, the effects of interplanetary dust, solar radiation pressure, and even the influence of the Milky Way's gravitational field were meticulously evaluated. Simulations recreated the probe's motion in minute detail, yet for a time, no combination of known forces fully accounted for the anomaly. The long-term consistency of the effect inspired speculation, from unmodelled forces within the solar system to more exotic interpretations suggesting limits of current physics. Colleagues debated vigorously at conferences and in journals, aware that a definitive explanation could either affirm decades of physics or hint at gaps in fundamental understanding. The anomaly also became a study in the human dimension of science. Analysts, some working decades-long careers tracking the probes, had to maintain exacting attention to detail, integrating countless small measurements from multiple instruments and correcting for tiny environmental effects. The calculations stretched over years, and each new iteration demanded collaboration between engineers, astronomers, and mathematicians. The quiet intensity of the work, the daily ritual of checking telemetry, refining models, and reconciling numbers with observations underscored the contrast between the profound emptiness of space and the intricate diligence required to understand it. Eventually, the origin of much of the anomaly was traced to the thermal recoil effect. Heat emitted asymmetrically from the RTGs, and internal electronics produced a tiny but consistent force opposite to the emitted photon's direction. When incorporated into the models, this accounted for the majority of the observed acceleration, restoring confidence in conventional physics. Yet even with this explanation, the episode left an enduring impression. The anomaly revealed the delicate interplay between measurement, modelling, and physical reality, and how even decades of careful observation can uncover subtle surprises. The probes had travelled far beyond the reach of direct observation, yet they spoke to humanity with the faint language of physics, demanding interpretation and contemplation. Beyond the thermal effect, the Pioneer anomaly retains a lingering philosophical resonance. It exemplifies how phenomena in deep space can challenge assumptions, prompting reflection on the limits of knowledge and the persistence of the unknown. Even when seemingly explained, the anomaly is a reminder that our understanding of the universe is provisional, constructed from careful observation but always subject to revision. Every pulse of data from the probes carries the weight of distance, time, and human scrutiny, highlighting both the triumph of science and the persistent whisper of what might still lie undiscovered. Decades later, Pioneer 10 and 11 continue their silent journey toward interstellar space, sending signals that fade slowly into the cosmic void. Their path, once mysterious and contested, is now reconciled with known physics, yet the image of these solitary emissaries drifting through the dark remains haunting. The anomaly, now largely understood as the interplay of thermal forces, stands as a testament to the subtle complexity of measurement and the patience required to detect forces billions of times weaker than those we experience on Earth. These spacecraft, relics of early human exploration, carry within their slow drift the story of precision, persistence, and the enduring mystery of space. Even as the forces were mapped and the data reconciled, the faint pull of the unknown lingered at the edge of calculation, hinting that the cosmos might conceal secrets beyond the reach of any instrument we have built. Cadet's time slip in Suffolk, 1957. Engines hummed across the hangar floor, the vibrations resonating through the cadets' boots as they prepared for the day's flight. RAF Bentwaters, nestled in the flat, windswept countryside of Suffolk, was alive with the disciplined rhythms of 1957. Technicians moving purposefully between de Havilland Vampire jets, instructors checking flight logs, and young cadets adjusting helmets and flight suits before boarding. The air carried the sharp scent of fuel and the metallic tang of machinery, a sensory landscape as familiar to the men as the charts and compasses they relied upon. Yet, on this particular day, routine would be disrupted by an experience that would challenge both perception and the linearity of time. In the cockpit, dials and compasses aligned perfectly as the young pilots followed the prescribed course over the patchwork of fields, hedgerows, and minor airstrips that marked their training circuit. Every instrument was checked, every pre-flight procedure executed to exacting standards. Radio communication buzzed intermittently, with instructors relaying standard navigational instructions while monitoring airspeed, altitude, and heading. The weather was calm, visibility good, wind minimal, and clouds low and distant. For the cadets, it was a typical sortie, a repetition of exercises drilled into them over weeks of preparation, yet the ordinary sequence of minutes would soon fracture in a way that left them struggling to reconcile observation with reality. Suddenly, the familiar landscape appeared to fold upon itself, as if hours and minutes had tangled in mid-flight. One cadet reported seeing a secondary horizon beneath the real one, a subtle duplication of trees and ditches that flickered in and out of view. Another described a sensation of speed that contradicted the altimeter reading. The jet felt both motionless and accelerating simultaneously. Radios crackled with static and brief, indistinct bursts of overlapping speech, some words intelligible, others distorted. Instruments registered no deviation from the expected readings, and yet the cadets' shared perception suggested that something extraordinary had occurred, something unmeasured by clocks or dials. Voices over the radio described events that instruments refused to confirm, a collision of perception and measured reality. Instructors heard accounts of sudden jumps in position over the terrain, as if the aircraft had advanced minutes ahead in time, and in response, multiple cadets reported a fleeting sense of déjà vu, recognizing landmarks that should not have been visible yet. Attempts to correlate the timing of these observations with ground radar data revealed no anomalies. Radar sweeps recorded continuous motion, while the cadets insisted on temporal displacement. The tension between human perception and mechanical verification created a dissonance that left both young pilots and supervising officers unsettled. In the office, logs were reviewed line by line, seeking any earthly explanation for the reports. Flight data books, radio transcripts, and meteorological records were meticulously examined. Winds were typical for late autumn, and no unusual atmospheric phenomena had been logged. The possibility of magnetic interference affecting compass readings was considered, yet local surveys showed no source capable of such distortions. Even the possibility of human error was scrutinized. Cadets were questioned individually, their accounts compared for consistency. Remarkably, each report described nearly identical experiences, despite the individuals being in separate jets at varying altitudes along the training route. Though explanations ranged from optical illusions to rare atmospheric phenomena, no single cause fully satisfied the accounts. Some historians later noted that temperature inversions could create fleeting mirages, duplicating landforms in the distance, while others speculated on psychological factors inherent in repetitive flight training. However, neither factor could adequately explain the shared perception of temporal discontinuity, the sensation of minutes skipping or overlapping in a manner that left multiple cadets simultaneously disoriented. The persistence of these reports suggested an event that was not only unusual, but also resistant to conventional measurement or rationalization. The cadets themselves carried the memory forward, a quiet unease that lingered long after their sortie concluded. Many noted subtle changes in their perception of flight and timing in the weeks that followed. Instruments that once felt precise seemed slower, clocks occasionally jumping in the corner of vision, and a recurring impression that the day's events had been longer or shorter than officially recorded. The base personnel, while skeptical, could not dismiss the official debriefs, and the event entered a minor but enduring chapter in RAF anecdotal history. For decades, the incident remained a footnote in flight manuals and oral tradition, discussed in hushed tones during reunions of cadets and instructors alike. In subsequent analyses, aviation historians cross-referenced weather logs, navigation charts, and cadet testimonies seeking any plausible mechanism for the perceived time displacement. Radar recordings confirmed continuous uninterrupted flight paths, and the mechanical reliability of Vampire jets was well documented, leaving human perception as the primary variable. Some theorists posited that rare optical phenomena combined with the mind's interpretation of rapidly changing scenery might have created the illusion of temporal distortion. Others suggested the possibility of as-yet unknown interactions between local geomagnetic fields and the jet's instrumentation, though no empirical evidence supported this. The mystery remained unresolved, a delicate balance between physical reality and human experience. Even decades later, when many of the cadets had retired from active service, the incident remained vivid in recollection. Interviews conducted by aviation researchers in the early 21st century consistently revealed detailed accounts, with witnesses describing a sense of dislocation in time and space that remained unquantifiable. The Suffolk skies, tranquil in appearance, had briefly hosted an event that defied measurement, leaving only human memory and sparse documentation to hint at its occurrence. Each retelling emphasized not just what was seen, but the strange sensation that minutes had skipped or folded, an unrecorded rhythm in the otherwise predictable flow of the day. In the quiet stretches above Suffolk, the hours once misaligned continue to ripple, leaving traces in memory that instruments cannot capture and words cannot fully convey. Philadelphia Experiment, 1943 USA. Steel decks gleamed under the overcast sky as the crew of the USS Eldridge prepared for maneuvers unlike any they had known. The war pressed relentlessly upon the United States, and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard buzzed with activity, a controlled chaos of rivets, oil, and hurried commands. Sailors adjusted uniforms, checked instruments, and monitored the ship's electrical systems while a handful of engineers moved among the decks with diagrams and notes, their eyes reflecting anticipation and unease. In whispered corners of the yard, speculation circled about secret programs and experimental technology, but most men focused on routine tasks. Routine, however, was about to fracture under a wave of reports that would blur the line between science and legend. Cables, generators, and arcane instruments were arranged with precision, their purpose understood by few but executed with exacting discipline. The ship was outfitted with experimental electromagnetic equipment designed to interact with radar systems in ways that remained classified. Power lines hummed faintly, and coils and condensers glimmered under the dim grey light, seeming almost alive. Engineers claimed the apparatus could render the vessel invisible to detection, a cloak against the eyes of enemy submarines and reconnaissance aircraft. The mechanics of the experiment were esoteric, rooted in principles of electromagnetism, relativity, and untested theories that blurred the boundary between possibility and fantasy. As the ship hummed with untested power, shadows bent unnaturally along the rails, and a strange vertigo gripped those on deck. Sailors reported a sudden chill, an inexplicable distortion of space around the hull, and the fleeting sensation that parts of the vessel had vanished, only to reappear moments later. Officers on the bridge noted compass readings fluctuating erratically, while the ship's outline seemed to shimmer in the mist. Accounts from the crew described time behaving oddly, with watches pausing or racing, and a sense of spatial dislocation that left even experienced sailors unsettled. Some claimed to glimpse colleagues in positions impossible for the moment, moving in ways that defied conventional explanation. Meters and oscilloscopes lined the deck, their needles quivering in anticipation as the electromagnetic generators charged incrementally. Engineers monitored fluctuations in current and voltage, while naval officers kept meticulous notes on power distribution and field intensity, ensuring that every loop, coil, and relay conformed to wartime protocols. The ship's bulkheads hummed with stored energy, and faint arcs of electricity occasionally sparked along insulated cables, a visible testament to forces far beyond routine operation. Sailors, both awed and anxious, whispered about the unusual greenish glow that seemed to ripple along the deck, though no natural source accounted for it. The preparation, equal parts mechanical and psychological, underscored the delicate balance between innovation and danger that the Eldridge embodied on that fateful day. Officers scrambled to reconcile what they saw with the instruments before them, but meters refused to register the impossible. Radio operators attempted to contact shore, yet signals appeared to vanish mid-transmission, returning garbled or delayed. Engineers on the lower decks measured energy surges far beyond expected outputs, while maintenance logs noted equipment that functioned normally, yet seemed affected by forces undetectable to human senses. Testimony collected later spoke of men becoming disoriented or fainting, and in some accounts individuals allegedly became partially embedded in the deck or walls, requiring urgent medical attention. Each record was carefully filed, creating a paper trail that alternately suggested brilliance, error, or deliberate obfuscation. Reports were filed meticulously, each word weighed against protocol, yet the truth remained obscured by secrecy and wartime urgency. Naval logs from July 1943 confirm maneuvers conducted by the Eldridge, but details of any unusual events are absent or redacted. Witness statements collected decades later describe phenomena that contradict the official record, yet the consistency of multiple testimonies lent credibility to the tale. Scholars and historians debating the Philadelphia experiment often find themselves balancing documented naval operations with anecdotal evidence, a tension between verifiable fact and extraordinary claim. The ship's known route, personnel assignments, and operational schedule offer a skeleton on which the more sensational accounts cling, creating a narrative that is both grounded and enigmatic. Though historians and scientists debated its feasibility, the experiment persisted in lore, a tale of human ambition brushing against unknown forces. Popular culture, UFO researchers, and fringe theorists amplified reports of invisibility, teleportation, and time displacement, intertwining them with speculation about government secrecy and advanced physics. Electromagnetic fields and radar cloaking, while theoretically plausible, would have required energy and technology far beyond 1940s capabilities. Yet the story continues to resonate, not because of certainty, but because of the persistent possibility that something extraordinary was attempted and observed. The narrative combines wartime ingenuity with the allure of science untested, the type of mystery that thrives on the boundary between reality and legend. The crew's accounts remain a window into the psychological and physical effects of extreme experimentation. Those involved describe moments of profound disorientation, nausea, and vertigo, alongside flashes of impossible perception. Seeing the ship disappear from view, perceiving time as disjointed, or experiencing physical sensations unaccounted for by known forces. Subsequent interviews suggest that even casual observers on shore noticed unusual light patterns and distortions near the dock. These minor, often overlooked details underscore the breadth of the anomaly, revealing that the experiment was not confined to the technical equipment alone, but also affected human perception in the surrounding environment. Though decades have passed, the Philadelphia experiment continues to hold the attention of both researchers and enthusiasts. The Eldridge itself, scrapped years ago, left behind no physical trace of extraordinary events, yet the story persists through testimony, classified documents, and investigative reporting. Attempts to simulate the experiment in later decades, using more sophisticated understanding of electromagnetism, cloaking, and relativistic effects, have yielded nothing conclusive. Still, the notion that human engineering could intersect with the subtle hidden properties of space, time, and matter lingers, a whisper of possibility that defies final resolution. Within the silent hull of the Eldridge, traces of what might have been linger, whispering that the boundaries of time and matter are more fragile than we imagine. Bold Street Time Slip, Liverpool, 1996. Shops hummed with activity, and the chatter of shoppers blended with the steady hum of traffic along Bold Street. The thoroughfare, lined with historic brick buildings, bustling cafes, and boutique storefronts, carried the rhythm of ordinary city life on a late autumn afternoon. Passers-by strolled with purpose, trolley wheels clattering on the pavement, while buses and delivery vans navigated the narrow lanes with practiced precision. The scent of roasted coffee and baked bread mingled with exhaust from idling engines, composing a sensory backdrop that felt reassuringly mundane. Pedestrians noted the familiar landmarks, the ornate facades of Liverpool's late Victorian buildings, shop signs swinging lightly in the wind, and the distant spire of St. Luke's Church overseeing the street. It was a scene repeated countless times, yet on this day, the ordinary would fracture in ways that defied explanation. Without warning, the familiar rhythm of the street faltered, as if the seconds themselves had begun to skip and repeat. A commuter crossing the street noticed that a delivery truck he had passed moments earlier seemed to reappear directly in front of him, yet its wheels bore no mark of regression. Footsteps echoed out of sync, pedestrians retracing motions they had already performed, while shop doors opened and closed in uncanny repetition. Sunlight bounced along glass panes in inconsistent angles, leaving fleeting patterns that vanished before they could be tracked. The sensation of temporal dissonance spread quickly, registering first in subtle unease and then in outright confusion. Even traffic lights seemed to hesitate, cycling too quickly or too slowly, as though the street itself had become unmoored from conventional time. Eyes widened as figures blurred and repeated their motions, and voices echoed with a dissonant, offbeat cadence. Passers-by instinctively looked to one another for confirmation, exchanging puzzled glances and questioning expressions. A shopkeeper, setting out a new display of clothing, watched in disbelief as a customer picked up a jacket, walked a few steps, and then inexplicably appeared to return to the same point in the shop without retracing any obvious path. Bus drivers slowed, uncertain whether they had seen the same pedestrian twice or if their senses were betraying them. In the midst of normal activity, a subtle but undeniable rhythm of repetition and overlap emerged, tangible enough to unsettle anyone who noticed. CCTV cameras recorded movement that defied logic, frames overlapping, moments duplicated, leaving analysts perplexed. Footage reviewed by local authorities showed pedestrians freezing mid-stride, their movements layered with previous seconds, creating a visual echo that had no clear cause. Some frames appeared smudged, as if time itself had smeared the images across multiple moments. Analysts noted that clocks visible in storefronts did not align with each other, with some appearing ahead while others lagged inexplicably. Photographs developed from the same day displayed similar anomalies. One image captured a woman twice in the same frame, walking toward the camera at different angles, yet with identical facial expressions. The physical evidence was fragmentary but persistent, documenting what observers on the street could only describe with astonishment. By evening, whispers of the incident had reached local newsrooms, and reporters scoured the street for explanations. Journalists interviewed residents, shopkeepers, and commuters, each describing slightly different but overlapping experiences. Local papers published accounts cautiously, noting unusual traffic patterns, reports of disorientation among pedestrians, and claims of repeated movements caught on surveillance cameras. A handful of urban historians later speculated that minor construction or nearby reflective surfaces could have caused visual misperceptions, but none could account for the temporal distortions noted across multiple witnesses. In coffee shops and offices, conversations lingered on the strange rhythm of that afternoon, the city's routine interrupted in ways that seemed to leave no trace beyond memory and media snippets. Though explanations ranged from optical illusions to collective hallucinations, no single theory fully accounted for the recorded inconsistencies. Some physicists later suggested that fleeting microclimatic effects or unusual reflections of sunlight through narrow streets might have created the perception of repeated movement. Psychologists considered mass suggestion or heightened awareness during rush hour crowds, yet the evidence, both physical and testimonial, resisted tidy classification. The experience hinted at something more elusive, a disruption not in individual perception alone, but in the temporal fabric itself, a phenomenon fleeting, localized, and remarkably consistent across multiple independent witnesses. The incident also left subtle, long-lasting effects on the perception of time among those who had experienced it. Several witnesses recalled later that their sense of elapsed time on Bold Street that afternoon felt compressed or extended, with personal watches sometimes registering seconds out of sync with reality. Anecdotes emerged over the years, shoppers recalling that they had retraced steps they could not logically have repeated, street performers describing minor echoes of their earlier movements, and bus drivers noting that traffic seemed out of sequence when retracing routes. These residual impressions were neither dramatic nor uniform, but they contributed to a persistent aura of mystery, leaving a thread of doubt about what truly occurred. Local historians and urban researchers have occasionally revisited the event, comparing CCTV footage, police logs, and press archives from November 1996. None found definitive causes, though the phenomenon remained consistently documented. The combination of technological recording, multiple witness accounts, and the everyday urban environment created a rare window into a temporal anomaly that was both mundane and extraordinary. The city's built environment, its buildings, streets, and reflective surfaces, may have amplified the perceptual oddities, yet the repeatability and coherence across different observers suggest an event that went beyond ordinary optical or psychological effects. The passage of time has done nothing to quell fascination with the Bold Street time slip. Writers, urban explorers, and fringe researchers have recounted the incident in documentaries, blogs, and oral histories, emphasizing its strange fidelity across diverse accounts. While many treat it as a curious footnote in Liverpool's history, the consistency of observations, CCTV evidence, photographs, and detailed testimonies ensures that it retains a haunting plausibility. The city's routine, normally precise and predictable, had briefly bent, allowing time itself to reveal a fractured rhythm beneath the surface of the familiar. Time had folded along Bold Street, leaving traces in movement and memory that no clock, camera, or witness could fully untangle. Woolwich Foot Tunnel Anomaly, London, UK. The curved walls of the Woolwich Foot Tunnel glistened with damp paint as commuters shuffled past, their footsteps merging into a steady, unremarkable rhythm. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting pale reflections along the Water Street tiles, while the hum of distant traffic on the Thames above resonated through the concrete ceiling. The tunnel, completed in 1912 and lined with riveted iron panels, had long served as a quiet conduit for pedestrians and cyclists navigating between Woolwich Arsenal and Thamesmead. On this ordinary autumn afternoon, the air carried a faint smell of damp concrete and a faint metallic tang, blending with the muted chatter of people making their way home. The passage was narrow enough that faces and gestures were intimate, familiar, yet today, familiarity would falter in subtle and inexplicable ways. Without warning, the familiar rhythm faltered, a second or two stretching impossibly long as the tunnel seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. Commuters felt it first as a hesitation beneath their feet, an imperceptible shift in the way light and shadow interacted along the walls. Tiles appeared to ripple in the corner of one woman's eye, and a cyclist noticed the faint distortion of his handlebars in reflection before the image snapped back into normality. A man walking briskly felt a sudden vertigo, the sensation that he had already passed the same section of tunnel moments ago, though his memory insisted he had not. For a few heartbeats, time seemed to adopt its own rhythm, independent of watches, clocks, or collective expectation. A young woman glanced back, convinced she had passed the same figure twice, yet the man ahead moved independently, as though shadows had separated from reality. She froze, hearing a faint echo of footsteps that should have already faded, and noticed the familiar rhythm of the crowd broken, as if it were running on two distinct cadences simultaneously. Others reported similar experiences. Gestures repeated, brief flashes of movement appeared duplicated, and the faint resonance of voices lingered longer than it should have. An elderly man described an uncanny sense that he was walking backward, even as his feet pressed forward. The tunnel, normally predictable and monotonous, had become a place where the familiar laws of time seemed suspended, bending perception into a space both alien and intimate. Security cameras recorded subtle irregularities, movements out of sync, fleeting blurs, and anomalies that resisted explanation. Reviewing CCTV footage later, analysts noted pedestrians appearing in one frame, then momentarily absent in the next, only to reappear slightly ahead of their original position. Shadows elongated unnaturally. Light reflections seemed to stretch across time as well as space, and the timing of repeated footsteps did not match the recorded clock on the video feed. While minor glitches were often expected in surveillance systems, These occurrences were repeated, precise, and consistent across multiple cameras covering the same stretch of tunnel. Analysts could not attribute the distortions to mechanical failure, digital error, or environmental conditions alone. Commuters spoke hesitantly to one another, unsure if they had imagined the repetition or glimpsed a fold in time itself. Conversations grew tentative, voices lowered as pedestrians sought confirmation of their impressions. Shop clerks and cyclists reported fleeting sensations of déjà vu so strong it bordered on disorientation, a subtle unease that lingered even after they emerged from the tunnel. Some described the faint echo of conversations they had yet to have, or the impression of walking alongside a duplicate self for a brief moment. The psychological effect, though temporary, left a quiet anxiety that pervaded the tunnel long after the anomalous interval had passed. The precise timing and consistency of the anomaly remained unexplained, even after thorough inspections and scientific analysis. Structural engineers and environmental specialists examined ventilation systems, lighting fluctuations, and acoustic reflections, yet no combination of factors produced the recurring duplication of motion observed on the CCTV footage. Local police and city archivists reviewed historical records of tunnel maintenance, seeking any irregularities in water seepage, electric current, or surveillance malfunction, but found none sufficient to explain the experience reported by multiple pedestrians. Researchers noted the particular geometry of the tunnel, its gentle curvature, narrow cross-section, and reflective surfaces, but while it may have influenced perception, it could not fully account for the temporal distortions. Even minor environmental details seemed implicated in the anomaly. The interplay of fluorescent lighting with the riveted iron panels created momentary visual echoes as commuters moved past, while small puddles along the floor mirrored light patterns with subtle delay. Passengers reported that the damp, echoing air seemed to stretch sound waves unevenly, so footsteps and voices occasionally arrived fractionally out of sync with expectation. These tiny inconsistencies compounded the psychological effect, heightening the sense of temporal dislocation. Ordinary materials, glass, metal, water, acted as instruments amplifying the perception of a reality slightly askew, a theatre in which time itself could be momentarily experienced as malleable. Residents and historians later compiled anecdotal reports, weaving together a record that combined fact, perception, and lingering mystery. Individuals remembered the brief episodes with vivid clarity, noting the exact location within the tunnel where repetition occurred, the approximate number of pedestrians present, and the small details of lighting or sound that framed the experience. Newspapers ran short notices about strange disturbances in the foot tunnel, though coverage was cautious, limited, and largely anecdotal. Over the years, the incident became a minor urban legend, a fragment of city lore quietly referenced in discussions of unexplained temporal phenomena. The anomaly's precise mechanics remained hidden, its effects ephemeral yet undeniable for those who'd walked its length that day. Time in the Woolwich foot tunnel remained a fragile construct, subtly warped and observed in fleeting intervals, resisting rational explanation yet persistent in the testimony of witnesses. Despite decades of study and curiosity, no subsequent occurrence matched the original incident in 1996, and the tunnel returned to its ordinary rhythm. Still, the memory of that day lingers among locals, footsteps repeated, reflections distorted, and a city street beneath the river briefly stripped of temporal certainty. It was a reminder that even mundane urban spaces can harbour moments where reality bends, revealing glimpses of time that refuse categorization or control. Echoes of impossible footsteps linger in the Thames Tunnel, a fleeting fracture in time untouched by reason. 10 amazing time-slip cases various. Across centuries and continents, ordinary people have glimpsed moments that seem to slip outside the natural flow of time. These experiences, fleeting yet persistent in memory, bridge the everyday with the impossible, leaving witnesses unsettled and historians intrigued. Each incident occurs in a mundane setting, a village path, a city street, a desert highway, but it carries the uncanny weight of events from another era, overlaid upon the present. While separated by geography, culture, and circumstance, these episodes share the haunting quality of temporal displacement, suggesting that beneath ordinary life, the past may occasionally reach forward, brushing against the now in moments too brief to fully measure. A shepherd in the rolling hills of Devon reported a sudden vision of a village that had vanished centuries before. He recalled green thatched roofs, smoke curling from chimneys, and villagers carrying baskets along the narrow lanes. As he approached, the scene flickered, replaced by the familiar pastoral fields of his own century. Local historians later identified the village from maps of the 15th century, noting that it had been abandoned long before the shepherd's birth. His description of streets, houses, and the exact placement of buildings matched the historical record with remarkable precision, though no physical trace of the village remained. High in the Appalachian Mountains, a hiker glimpsed the clatter of saws and the shadows of men long absent from the modern woods. Timber camps from the late 1800s appeared along a remote clearing, complete with log cabins and smoke rising from fires. The hiker, seasoned in backcountry travel, reported feeling the sudden drop of temperature and the faint scent of wood smoke, sensations inconsistent with the present day. When he returned the following year, no sign of the camp existed. Modern forest growth had reclaimed the clearing, yet his account included details that matched archival photographs of logging operations from the 19th century, creating a puzzle that remains unresolved. In Tokyo's bustling streets, the hum of trams mingled with echoes of a time long past, where kimono-clad figures passed without acknowledgement. A pedestrian noted the overlapping sounds of horse hooves and streetcars, the flicker of lanterns against electric signage, and faces that seemed familiar yet entirely foreign. Newspapers of the 1930s later documented tram schedules and the presence of certain shops that no longer existed, mirroring what the pedestrian had perceived. The scene dissolved as quickly as it appeared, leaving the observer questioning whether it had been a hallucination or an actual window into a vanished Tokyo. Along a sun-baked stretch of highway in Arizona, a motorist glimpsed a tiny station that should not have existed, gleaming briefly before fading. The station, complete with a short platform and a single train car, appeared decades out of sync with the modern road. When the driver circled back moments later, only desert scrub and a gravel lot remained. Cartographic records confirmed that no such station had been built in that location during the 20th century, yet witnesses later corroborated the brief visual phenomenon, describing a distinct architectural style inconsistent with the modern highway. A narrow alley in Paris shimmered, revealing merchants and horse-drawn carts from a time before gas lamps illuminated the streets. A tourist described the rich scent of bread and roasting chestnuts, the clang of iron wheels on cobblestones, and the chatter of people in attire centuries older than the surrounding city. Photographs taken inadvertently captured faint, ghostly overlays of the old market scene, which experts later verified aligned with maps and paintings of pre-revolutionary Paris. These spectral traces persisted only for moments, yet they left a vivid imprint in the memories of those present. A mist-laden ridge in the Scottish Highlands seemed to host soldiers marching from another century, their movements vivid yet untouchable. A climber, descending after an early morning hike, reported the sound of drum beats and the clink of armour, while the landscape appeared animated by figures long gone. Historical records indicated that a minor skirmish had taken place nearby during the Jacobite risings, though no contemporary witness survived to describe it. The climber's account matched military positioning and uniforms from archival sources, suggesting a brief but accurate manifestation of history in motion. Amid shifting dunes in the Sahara, an oasis appeared, complete with tents and figures that belonged to a vanished caravan of long ago. A nomad recounted the fleeting vision of traders negotiating and camels kneeling to drink water, only for the scene to evaporate into the endless sand. Satellite imagery later identified no unusual vegetation or temporary water sources, reinforcing the notion that the experience was temporal rather than spatial. Yet oral histories from the region preserve similar stories, hinting at a recurrent phenomenon among those traversing the desert's vast expanse. A fisherman's gaze caught schooners gliding silently across the New England harbour, rigging and sails from an era centuries past. The wooden ships appeared solid, their reflection mirrored on the water, even as modern vessels continued their routine navigation. Local maritime records confirmed the dimensions and rigging style of the vessels as historically accurate for the 1700s, though no trace remained once the vision concluded. The fisherman described the fleeting encounter with reverence, noting how the water itself seemed to hold the memory of vessels long vanished. In the dusty expanse of the Australian outback, A homestead flourished in sunlight, yet maps and memory showed it had long ceased to exist. A rancher noted livestock grazing, a freshly repaired fence, and smoke rising from a chimney, only to find barren land upon revisiting the spot moments later. Survey records confirmed the property had been abandoned decades prior, yet the visual manifestation had all the hallmarks of a fully inhabited settlement. The rancher's description included precise details, from the type of crops to the colour of the paint on the house, aligning with historical documentation. Along the Venetian canals, gondolas glided past in a scene centuries old, their passengers unaware of the modern observers. Tourists described sunlight reflecting off water in patterns that belonged to a Renaissance-era cityscape, while bridges and buildings appeared subtly different from contemporary architecture. Archival research later confirmed that the configuration of certain canals and gondola routes matched 16th century layouts, lending credibility to the brief but vivid temporal overlay. The city seemed to fold, revealing an echo of its own history, alive yet untouchable by the present moment. Though separated by geography and centuries, these episodes share uncanny patterns, fleetingly bridging the present and the past. Witnesses consistently note that the experiences are brief, often lasting only seconds or minutes, and leave impressions more in memory and perception than in lasting physical evidence. Yet repeated occurrences, corroborated historical details, and independent eyewitness accounts suggest a phenomenon that transcends imagination alone. Whether through architecture, sound, or the motion of people, time occasionally bends in subtle, precise ways, leaving ephemeral windows through which the past reaches forward to brush against the present. In unexpected places, time leaves traces, fleeting echoes that blur the line between what is and what was. Pilot time anomaly sightings, various 20th C. Above open skies, beyond the reach of ordinary observers, pilots have reported glimpses of the impossible, fleeting and inexplicable in the stillness of flight. From World War II bombers to late 20th century commercial airliners, aviators have described moments in which the familiar contours of the atmosphere shifted to reveal events or objects seemingly from another time. These occurrences often manifest at high altitudes, where the isolation and silence of flight amplify the perception of anomaly. Witnesses recount distorted clouds, sudden flashes of other aircraft, and instruments behaving in ways that suggest a faint interference with the normal order of time. Though technology and aircraft types differ, the reports share an unsettling commonality. The skies themselves appear to retain echoes of history, momentarily accessible to those who traverse them. In the European theatre during World War II, a bomber crew spotted a squadron of planes flying in formations inconsistent with the known enemy or Allied aircraft. The crew observed the sleek contours of aircraft that bore design elements decades ahead of their own planes, glinting in the morning sun before dissolving into the mist. Radar logs showed no concurrent blips, yet multiple crew members confirmed the visual anomaly. Historians later noted that no experimental aircraft had been deployed in that sector at the time, leaving the sighting unexplained. The intensity of the sunlight on the metal fuselage and the formation's precision etched the image into the memory of the men, who recounted it in interviews long after the war. A reconnaissance pilot over Eastern Europe during the early Cold War observed a lone craft materialize briefly on the horizon before vanishing without a trace. The aircraft appeared to hover for a few seconds, reflecting light in a way that suggested a structure unfamiliar to the pilot's training. Despite scanning with onboard radar, nothing registered. Instruments remained stable. Decades later, declassified intelligence reports confirmed no known flights coincided with the sighting, leaving only the testimony of a trained observer. The pilot's description of maneuvering and altitude changes, captured in his logbooks, corresponded with exact locations that remained verifiable, providing a rare alignment between perception and record. Cruising above the Atlantic in the 1970s, a commercial captain glimpsed the silhouette of a biplane weaving through clouds where only jetliners should exist. Passengers reported noticing an unusual shimmer against the sky, and the captain adjusted his heading in case of collision. Instruments indicated no nearby traffic. When the plane passed beyond the disturbance, the airspace was empty once again, as if the biplane had never existed. Aviation archives confirmed no flights were scheduled in that corridor at the time, nor were any vintage aircraft known to operate there. The fleeting image, vivid in memory, left both crew and passengers unsettled, a temporal mirage inexplicably tied to the altitude and trajectory of their flight. At Mach 2, a test pilot described clouds elongating and folding, as if the atmosphere itself carried memories of flights past. Instruments fluctuated briefly, suggesting minor electromagnetic interference, yet no mechanical or meteorological explanation satisfied the observer. The pilot reported a sense of acceleration that did not match speed readings, a momentary dissociation between perception and instrument reality. Test flight logs show normal operations otherwise, yet the detailed sketches made by the pilot afterward depict cloud formations and apparent trails of aircraft absent from official flight records. The incident is catalogued among high-speed aviation anomalies, noted for its combination of physical and perceptual irregularities. Over the Arctic expanse, ice fields revealed vessels from decades earlier, appearing briefly as if layered atop the present ice pack. Navigational charts confirmed no contemporary shipping in the vicinity, yet the pilot and navigator observed schooners and icebreakers, their wakes etched in the frozen channels. The vision lasted only moments, yet the arrangement and size of the vessels precisely matched historical maps from the early 20th century. Meteorological conditions were calm, eliminating mirage effects common in polar regions. The navigator's diary, preserved in the National Archive, records the encounter in precise detail, noting both the temporal incongruity and the fleeting clarity of the observation. During a routine training sortie in the 1980s, a cadet reported a second plane shadowing every maneuver, yet radar showed nothing. The aircraft mirrored barrel rolls, tight turns, and climbs with exact precision, disappearing only when cloud cover thickened. Ground controllers confirmed no concurrent flights. Flight instructors interviewed afterward noted that the cadet's account contained technical terminology consistent with professional observation, ruling out simple misperception. Aviation logs and student reports from the squadron consistently include references to unusual visual phenomena during advanced maneuvers, suggesting a pattern in which high-performance flight occasionally coincides with temporal anomalies. In the 1990s, passengers crossing the Pacific reported visions of vessels and clouds that seemed centuries out of place. Flight attendants observed the shimmer of rigging on distant ships and faint outlines of gliders no longer in operation. Pilots reported subtle distortions in light refraction at the horizon, paired with the anomalous shapes. The scene dissipated within seconds, yet witnesses recalled minute details, the position of masts, the sequence of sails, and the reflections on water surfaces that mirrored photographs from archival collections. Atmospheric scientists later confirmed that the lighting and weather conditions alone could not account for the sharpness and accuracy of the visual impressions. On a routine military helicopter patrol, the crew saw formations of aircraft that contradicted both instrumentation and memory, appearing for seconds then gone. Pilots noted sudden compass deviations and erratic altimeter readings as the images flickered in and out. The phenomenon was corroborated by onboard cameras, which captured only faint streaks and distortions rather than fully formed aircraft. Analysts later suggested that the combination of reflective ice fields, sun angle, and pilot perception could produce optical artifacts, yet the precision of formation patterns and timing remains unexplained. The crew described a palpable sense of historical layering, as if the sky itself remembered the choreography of airspace past. Across decades, from biplanes to supersonic jets, the reports share a disquieting rhythm. The sky itself seems to carry echoes of past flights. Pilots repeatedly describe brief durations, sudden appearances and disappearances, and the vivid clarity of objects that defy the timeline of contemporary aviation. Even when corroborating instruments fail to register the anomaly, memory and sketches preserve the phenomenon in remarkable detail. While aviation technology, geography, and decades vary, a consistent thread emerges. Time occasionally reveals itself in the air, tangible only to those isolated above the clouds, where ordinary perception collides with the extraordinary. The paths of countless flights etch themselves into the air, subtle marks that reveal themselves only to those who traverse the skies. Pan Am Flight 914 Legend, 1955-1980 S. The legend of Pan Am. Flight 914 begins not with an official record but with a story that refuses to fade. It tells of a Douglas DC-4 that departed from New York in 1955 bound for Miami, then vanished from both radar and memory. According to the tale, the aircraft reappeared 37 years later, emerging unannounced in Venezuelan airspace before vanishing once again. For decades, this account has circulated in newspapers, television segments, and online archives of the unexplained. While many investigators dismiss it as an urban myth born of mistaken reporting, its endurance and the precision of its recurring details have ensured its place among aviation's most persistent enigmas. The story's roots can be traced to the post-war years, when Pan American World Airways symbolized the height of mid-century optimism. In 1955, Pan Am's fleet of propeller-driven DC-4s regularly connected New York, Miami, and the Caribbean, a corridor of blue skies and bustling expansion. Schedules, routes, and passenger manifests were meticulously maintained. No Pan Am aircraft of that year was ever documented as permanently lost along that route. Yet by the 1980s, a sensational narrative began to circulate. A plane from 1955 had reportedly landed in Caracas, its crew unaware that decades had passed. The image of a shining silver DC-4 descending through the Venezuelan heat became an enduring vision of temporal displacement. According to versions of the account first printed in tabloid weeklies, air traffic controllers at Caracas' Simón Bolívar Airport reported an unidentified plane appearing suddenly on their radar screens on May 21, 1985. The craft was described as an older model, its 4 propellers spinning in defiance of the jet age. When radio contact was established, the pilot allegedly identified himself as Captain Victor Gruber of Pan American Flight 914, en route from New York to Miami with 57 passengers aboard. Controllers, confused, informed the pilot that the date was 1985, not 1955. In response, the captain reportedly shouted in disbelief, declared his intent to depart, and vanished again into the clouds. No official transcripts or air traffic recordings of this event have ever surfaced. Nonetheless, the story's details proliferated, replicated almost identically across continents. The earliest printed source can be traced to a 1985 issue of the Weekly World News, a tabloid known for fictionalized accounts of paranormal and sensational events. Despite this origin, the narrative continued to evolve, retold on television, documentaries, and internet forums well into the 21st century. The enduring fascination lies not merely in the implausibility of the claim, but in its eerie specificity, the model of aircraft, the pilot's name, the precise dialogue, even the coordinates of its supposed reappearance. Historical context deepens the intrigue. The Douglas DC-4, developed in the 1940s, was a mainstay of Pan Am's fleet, capable of cruising at 200 miles per hour with a range of over 4,000 kilometers. It had no modern transponder or digital navigation system, relying instead on radio beacons and manual calculations. To imagine such a machine emerging in 1985 airspace, detected by radar and radio alike, creates a vivid contradiction between eras. Aviation historians note that no Pan Am flight in 1955 ever matched the call sign or passenger count described in the story, and no civil aviation records mention any such radar incident in Venezuela. Yet photographs often accompany retellings. A DC-4 parked near a tropical runway, its paint faded but intact. None are traceable to verifiable archives. Attempts to identify the supposed witnesses have led to further confusion. The controllers quoted in the reports never existed in official Venezuelan employment records, nor do any Venezuelan or US aviation authority corroborate the event. Even so, the story's persistence mirrors the cultural anxiety surrounding air travel in the mid-20th century, when flight itself symbolized both freedom and the possibility of disappearance. In this sense, Pan Am Flight 914 occupies a symbolic space between myth and memory, representing humanity's fear that progress can sometimes move too quickly to comprehend. Skeptical researchers point out that the story's publication coincided with a wave of other aviation mysteries popularized in the 1980s, including the Philadelphia experiment revival and claims of Bermuda Triangle re-entries. Each narrative exploited the same theme: the return of something long vanished, untouched by time. Unlike these, however, the Pan Am tale lacked even a partial foundation in official documentation. It exists entirely within the realm of storytelling, supported only by repetition. Yet, the repetition itself became its power, each retelling transforming it from fabrication to folklore. For aviation historians, the endurance of the legend offers insight into how modern myths form. The inclusion of technical detail, the model number, the pilot's name, the coordinates, creates a scaffolding of credibility. Listeners unfamiliar with aviation procedures find the story plausible precisely because of these specifics. Meanwhile, the emotional structure of the account, a journey begun, lost, and then impossibly resumed, reflects a universal narrative pattern. It is the same rhythm found in maritime ghost stories, missing time encounters, and even ancient myths of return from the underworld. Parallel legends have emerged around other aircraft. Reports of wartime planes appearing decades later, or pilot voices heard on frequencies long abandoned, echo the same pattern. These accounts, though unverifiable, persist in pilot folklore. Investigators catalogue them alongside radar ghosts and phantom echoes, phenomena caused by reflections, temperature inversions, or electronic interference. Yet none possess the cultural endurance of Pan Am Flight 914. Its details are too evocative. A silver plane from a vanished airline, returning to a sky it no longer belongs in, a pilot unaware of the century he has crossed. Digital archives reveal that in every decade since the 1980s, the story has resurfaced under new titles. It has been translated into multiple languages, adapted into online videos, and even reconstructed with fabricated photographs. Each generation adds subtle modifications. The year of return changes, the airport shifts location, yet the core narrative remains untouched. For some, the persistence of such a legend is itself a mystery, while a verifiably false event continues to evoke unease, as though the collective mind resists letting it go. The truth, perhaps, lies not in any lost aircraft, but in the human desire to imagine one moment in which time itself falters. What endures most is the image, a Pan Am DC-4 descending through Venezuelan sunlight, its pilot unaware of the century beneath him, its passengers gazing down upon a world that no longer remembers their names. No radar record exists, no passenger list remains, but the story's precision ensures it remains vivid, a timeless contradiction hovering between skepticism and belief. The air over Caracas holds no trace of the plane, yet the legend continues to circle there, unseen but never forgotten. Train arriving before departure, Europe. In post-war Europe, the rhythm of modern travel echoed along steel rails built on promises of precision. Stations rebuilt from wartime ruin gleamed with timetables printed in strict columns, each minute accounted for, each whistle an echo of progress. From the Baltic ports to the Adriatic coast, railway systems synchronized with atomic clocks and telegraph networks, creating a continental choreography where delay itself was a kind of heresy. Time and travel, once at odds, had become one seamless mechanism. In an age when minutes defined nations, railway clocks were not mere instruments but symbols of trust. Conductors synchronized pocket watches before departure. Signalmen confirmed every clearance by coded bell tones. Schedules were printed to the second, and even a 2-minute variance could trigger an investigation. Europe's great rail corridors, Paris to Vienna, Berlin to Rome, operated on precision bordering on ritual. To the travelling public, a train's arrival was as predictable as sunrise. Until one spring morning in the early 1950s, that certainty faltered. The first account emerged from a dispatch clerk who noticed a contradiction buried in routine paperwork. According to the Telegraph records, the eastbound express from Budapest was scheduled to depart at 7:45 a.m. local time. Yet the arrival log from Ljubljana, some 300 kilometers west, recorded its entry at 6:55, 50 minutes before it had even left Hungarian soil. The clerk, assuming a clerical mistake, recalculated the codes and checked the station seals. Every figure matched. The timestamp bore no error. Scattered through the fragmented archives of post-war railway communication, telegrams and dispatch notes show that the timing error was first dismissed as a simple equipment fault rather than an impossibility. At the time, Europe's rail network was shifting from mechanical to electrical timekeeping, introducing synchronization issues between local and central clocks. Investigators at the Deutsche Bundesbahn Technical Office noted that the recorded arrival and departure stamps had been certified by independent telegraph signals, which meant human error could not fully explain the discrepancy. Even the punch card time records, known for their reliability, matched the anomaly to the second. This intersection of technological precision and inexplicable deviation only deepened the uncertainty, suggesting that the event was not a myth of memory, but a failure of time itself to behave consistently. At precisely 7:10, station workers at Ljubljana Central swore they saw the Budapest Express glide into Platform 3. The locomotive bore its correct designation, MAV 301, and its compartments were half lit with passengers staring through the glass, as if caught between sleep and waking. Conductors stepped out, took brief orders, and retreated inside. Minutes later, the train departed westward, leaving behind a faint smell of iron and ozone. When Budapest later confirmed that the same train was just then leaving its depot, both stations locked their reports. Steam drifted across the marble concourse, curling around the enamel signs as if time itself had exhaled. Ticket inspectors recalled that the arriving train made no sound beyond the low hiss of cooling pistons. A platform guard swore the lamps along the carriage roofs flickered at irregular intervals, as though powered by an unstable current. One passenger, a young woman in a travelling coat, was said to have waved absently through the glass before fading into the moving blur of departure. Her description matched no one on the Budapest manifest. When the telegraph office checked its records, the message of departure had not yet been sent. The electrical pulse confirming the train's release from Keleti station would not leave the Hungarian line for another 40 minutes. Technicians reviewed the network's copper relays and ground circuits. No surges, no duplication, no delayed bursts appeared. On paper, both events, the departure and the arrival, existed simultaneously yet impossibly apart, like parallel notes struck in different rooms. Elsewhere on the continent, isolated reports told of similar irregularities, engines seen before they should exist. A freight train glimpsed outside Zurich minutes before its recorded departure. A passenger coach in Belgium was found listed twice in the same logbook, its arrivals and exits overlapping like mirrored reflections. These were anomalies dismissed by administrators as harmless duplications, yet to railway historians they hinted at something deeper, a distortion within the clockwork of European rail itself. Officials invoked human error first, suggesting misfiled manifests or faulty transmissions. Yet handwriting analysis showed no correction marks, and the synchronized telegraph system used internationally verified time signals. Others blamed atmospheric interference or experimental radar reflections from NATO installations, though no frequency tests supported it. Each rational proposal collapsed under the same weight. The evidence contained no human mistake to correct. In the weeks that followed, railway authorities conducted quiet interviews under flickering depot lights. The Ljubljana signalmen were transferred to other districts, and the dispatch clerk who discovered the inconsistency resigned, citing an inability to reconcile time. Internal memos classified the incident as administrative irregularity, sealing it within the Ministry of Transport archives. By the time journalists requested comment years later, the relevant pages had been misplaced. The years did little to still the tale. Within railway folklore, the event endured as a legend that refused to slow. Retellings claimed the train vanished between stations, or that it carried passengers who later wrote letters dated before their departure. Each version adjusted the geography but kept the same rhythm, a train appearing early, a timetable unable to explain it, and witnesses certain of what they saw. Skeptics cited collective error, yet the story persisted in railway circles as a caution against absolute faith in the clock. To move through space is to move through time, yet on that particular morning the two seemed to disagree. If the telegraph was accurate, the Budapest Express crossed both, arriving at its destination before its own departure was even recorded, a journey neither forward nor backward but outside the order of hours entirely. Between the borders of Hungary and Slovenia, a brief fracture in order occurred, time, for once, without a timetable. Soldier who walked into tomorrow and Rakisu. In the dying days of the Second World War, the borders of Europe were in motion. Armies dissolved, maps blurred, and towns fell silent under the echo of retreat. It was within this atmosphere of confusion that one of the most persistent wartime anomalies emerged. the account of a British soldier who, during a routine patrol in northern France, reportedly vanished in 1945 and reappeared decades later, unchanged. Few records exist to explain the event, yet its fragments persist in declassified notes and post-war testimonies. The soldier was identified only as Private Reginald D., stationed near Lille as part of a communications unit tasked with maintaining field relay stations. On a fog-laden morning in late March, he was last seen walking down a narrow road bordered by hedgerows, carrying a portable radio transmitter. When he failed to return, his section presumed he had been captured by German holdouts or lost in the chaos of demobilization. His disappearance was noted but not pursued, one among thousands swallowed by the retreating front. Weeks later, the area was reclaimed and surveyed by Allied logistics teams who recorded no evidence of skirmish or struggle. Reginald's equipment, rations and service rifle were never recovered. His name was added to the missing in action register, filed alongside men who had vanished under far more ordinary conditions. The case would have faded completely were it not for a file opened 35 years later in a quiet police station near Dover. The report, dated August 1980, described a disoriented man found wandering near the ferry terminal at dawn. He wore a tattered British Army uniform consistent with the 1945 issue. Khaki battle dress, hobnailed boots, and a service number stitched in the old format. He carried identification tags marked with Reginald's name and regiment, their lettering corroded but intact. According to the attending constable, the man spoke in clipped wartime vernacular, unaware of the year or his surroundings. He claimed to have been separated from his unit during a morning patrol near Lille, and seemed unable to comprehend the presence of motorways, ferry lights or modern signage. At first, local authorities assumed the case was a hoax, another eccentric or impersonator, echoing the myths of vanished soldiers. Yet, when the man's fingerprints were compared against the Ministry of Defence archives, they matched perfectly with the 1945 records of the missing private. No family remained alive to identify him, and his physical condition was startling. His age, by all accounts, appeared to be 25. Archival specialists at the Imperial War Museum examined his uniform and gear, noting that the textile composition, stitching and insignia were all period authentic, showing no signs of modern reproduction. The watch he carried had stopped at 9:47, a detail matching the timestamp of his final recorded radio message before disappearance. When questioned under controlled psychological observation, he described hearing a tearing sound in the air before finding himself in the same place, only empty and too quiet, then walking toward what he thought was camp. The environment, he said, looked right, but wrong in the light. From a scientific standpoint, the case baffled those who examined it. The Home Office's Forensic Pathology Division could find no biological anomaly beyond mild dehydration and shock. Time, at least by cellular measure, had not advanced. Military psychiatrists speculated dissociative amnesia or extreme temporal disorientation, yet none could explain the continuity of uniform decay, nor the fingerprint confirmation. The file was marked inconclusive and sealed under the classification Temporal Event Unverified. Historians later uncovered similar accounts from other conflicts, where soldiers reportedly vanished for years before resurfacing unchanged. One 1917 report from the Somme described 3 infantrymen disappearing into mist during an artillery barrage, their shouts heard moments later as if from underground. Another, from 1952 Korea, involved a US lieutenant said to have walked into a hillside haze and never re-emerged. In each, the location, atmospheric conditions, and sudden silence were eerily consistent. Among the more skeptical explanations ranged from espionage cover stories to atmospheric distortions affecting perception and radio signals. Some researchers proposed that sudden electromagnetic discharges from radar installations could have induced hallucinatory episodes, making witnesses believe that time had fractured. But in Reginald's case, the geography offered no such installations, and the path he walked remained rural and unaltered, a simple road between fields that still existed in its original form decades later. Documents released under the British National Archives Act in 2015 revealed that the Defence Research Establishment had quietly reviewed the Dover case in the early 1980s. Internal memoranda referenced localised temporal discrepancies and physical return phenomena. Notes from one analyst remarked that the subject displayed no chronological dissonance, suggesting he had not perceived the passage of decades. No public statement was ever issued, and the man identified as Reginald D. was transferred to a private military hospital under restricted observation. What happened afterward remains unknown. It is said that the road outside Lille where he vanished still draws quiet visitors. Historians, curiosity seekers, and veterans who stand at its edge and remark on the sound of the wind through the hedges. Farmers nearby have long reported strange interference on their radios when the weather turns damp, as if old transmissions echo faintly through the static. Local folklore now calls it the Soldier's Corridor, a place where time once slipped its line and let a man walk straight into another century. Time, it seemed, had not taken him at all. It had simply changed its rhythm, letting one soldier keep walking long after history had moved on without him. Submarine lost in time, Cold War legend. The ocean keeps its own calendar, marked not by days or years, but by the slow erosion of metal and the fading of light. Beneath its surface, sound travels farther than sight, and even steel can seem mortal. Ships vanish there without final witnesses, their stories absorbed into currents that never return the same. Among the many tales whispered by sailors and signal operators, one stands apart. A submarine said to have slipped not only beneath the waves, but beyond time itself. It was known as the USS Valiant, a fast-attack submarine once stationed along the North Atlantic corridor, where shifting temperatures could twist sonar readings and magnetic lines ran wild beneath polar skies. Officially, its last mission took place in April 1968, a period of uneasy silence between world powers. Yet the legend insists that the Valiant did not sink as history recorded. Instead, decades later, it was sighted again. Its hull unaged, its crew alive, still transmitting from a world that no longer existed. The last confirmed contact came through a short routine message sent from the Greenland-Iceland Gap, a channel known for its strategic importance during the Cold War. Radio's operators monitoring the fleet described the signal as clear and calm until its final seconds, when the transmission distorted into a high-frequency oscillation that no one could identify. It was as if the message had bent through water dense with electricity. Then, silence. No distress call followed, no sonar return, no trace of wreckage or oil slick to mark the place of loss. Naval Command conducted a full search, deploying aircraft, sonar buoys and patrol ships across hundreds of miles. Despite weeks of effort, no evidence surfaced. The Atlantic, they concluded, had simply taken another vessel. Yet what unsettled investigators were the final telemetry readings recovered from the Valiant's systems. The depth gauge, normally precise to the foot, had fluctuated erratically between 300 and 900 feet in a span of seconds. Instruments recorded pressure changes that should have torn the hull apart, yet no damage report had been issued before the signal ceased. These anomalies were quietly filed under unverified readings, a bureaucratic term for data that refused explanation. 3 decades later, in the winter of 1997, a British trawler drifting north of the Norwegian Sea reported an encounter that revived the story. In heavy fog, its radar captured a large metallic form ascending from below, followed by a dark hull breaking the surface. Lightning illuminated the vessel for only a moment, but long enough for the crew to see a number painted along the side, the same identification once belonging to the USS Valiant. Men were visible on the deck, their uniforms unfamiliar yet distinctly naval. When the trawler attempted radio contact, no reply came, and within minutes the submarine submerged again, leaving a circle of churning foam and instruments flickering with static interference. Authorities dismissed the sighting as an error or deliberate hoax until a week later, when a distress transmission was intercepted by a Norwegian monitoring post. The signal carried an outdated US Navy code from the 1960s and included a timestamp reading April 17, 1968, the day the Valiant disappeared. Its brief message declared mission ongoing. Analysts verified the encryption pattern as authentic but could not explain how it reappeared intact after nearly 30 years of obsolescence. Oceanographers proposed natural explanations. The Norwegian Sea's magnetic disturbances were known to distort instruments, and sound can echo in deep layers for years, trapped within thermal boundaries before emerging elsewhere. Some believed the message was a ghost transmission, the delayed reflection of a long-dead signal. Yet the message's precision, and its continued repetition every 72 hours over 3 weeks, forced reconsideration. A multinational expedition was quietly assembled to investigate the coordinates. Using deep-sea sonar, the team identified a vessel lying upright on the seabed at 3,000 meters. The outline matched a Skipjack-class submarine, the same model as the Valiant. Cameras lowered through murky water captured images of the hull, its paint intact, no corrosion, no marine growth, as if preserved in air rather than salt. The ship's nameplate gleamed faintly beneath layers of sediment, untouched by decades of ocean wear. When a probe entered through the forward hatch, interior lights flickered on despite no external power supply. Control panels glowed weakly. Gauges quivered as though responding to unseen pressure changes. The air vents expelled faint condensation, and the internal temperature registered near human range. Then, in a narrow frame of footage near the periscope bay, something moved. A figure standing motionless in uniform, its face indistinct behind a glass reflection. The feed ended abruptly, the signal cutting to static. The footage was reviewed repeatedly before being classified and removed from the public record. Only transcripts remain, later cited by maritime journals, that hinted at suppressed discoveries. Officially, the object on the seabed was deemed an unidentified metallic structure, but subsequent satellite sonar continued to detect subtle movement, the outline shifting slightly, as though repositioning beneath the current. Skeptics argued the Valiant never existed, that it was a code name for a covert prototype lost during tests. Others linked the account to psychological warfare experiments designed to mislead Soviet surveillance, citing similar confusion around the USS Scorpion and K-100 29 incidents of 1968. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the maintenance record unearthed years later. A requisition request dated 1998 for parts compatible only with the Valiant's propulsion system, stamped with the authorization code of its long-deceased engineering officer. Among families of the lost crew, stories persisted. One widow described receiving a letter from her husband 2 years after his official death, postmarked in 1970 but written on Navy stationery dated April 1968. The ink was fresh, the signature authentic, and the envelope bore no signs of aging. Another family claimed to have intercepted faint shortwave broadcasts that included the names of shipmates, names long carved into memorial stone. In naval archives, the Valiant remains listed as lost with all hands, yet certain sealed reports reference it under active classification, as if some part of its mission continues in record if not in time. Oceanographers still speak of strange sonar pulses near its coordinates, steady, rhythmic intervals identical to those of a US submarine beacon from the late 1960s. The ocean has never surrendered its secrets easily. Between its shifting layers, the boundary between years may blur, allowing what once was to drift beside what is. And in that suspended depth, the USS Valiant may still be moving, her crew unknowing, their clocks forever set to the moment before silence. In the dark waters of the North Atlantic, a patrol persists, sealed within a world time forgot. The astronaut who spoke to his younger self. In the final decade of the 20th century, deep within the archives of NASA's Johnson Space Center, a recording surfaced that should not have existed. Its label was ordinary: Apollo Training Simulation 1969. But the timestamp on the magnetic reel suggested it had been logged 2 years before the voice it contained could have been recorded. The voice belonged to a man who would, years later, walk on the moon. What unsettled the archivists was that the same man's voice could also be heard responding from the other end of the transmission. Records show that Commander Alan Merritt was one of NASA's most meticulous pilots. Born in Ohio in 1933, he had joined the Air Force at 21 and logged over 4,000 flight hours before joining the Astronaut Corps in 1962. His colleagues described him as pragmatic, cautious, and devoid of superstition, a man grounded in procedure and precision. Yet in later years, when pressed about a peculiar incident during his lunar mission, he would respond with a single phrase that none of his peers could explain: "I heard myself in the loop." During the early Apollo missions, communication systems were primitive compared to today's digital precision. engineers relied on analog radio links that sometimes introduced echoes or signal reflections when transmissions bounced off the moon's surface. Yet the anomaly recorded on Merritt's training tapes defied even those explanations. The first voice, verified as Merritt's, issued a standard telemetry request. The reply came 2.6 seconds later, the expected delay from lunar distance, but carried data that referenced coordinates and mission details from a future that had not yet occurred. NASA engineers initially dismissed it as a simulation artifact. The agency's audio analysis division reviewed the frequency spectrum and confirmed the spectral signature of both voices matched Merritt's vocal profile precisely. A secondary review by Bell Labs suggested the tape may have been overwritten multiple times, creating phantom echoes through magnetic imprinting, but even that theory failed to explain why the voice on the reply channel mentioned events from 1971, 2 years after the recording's creation. Merritt himself appeared deeply unsettled when the anomaly was first presented to him. According to declassified internal memos, he requested that the reel be destroyed, citing the potential psychological distraction it could cause his team. Yet the copy survived, kept in a mislabeled container discovered decades later by an archivist cataloguing obsolete telemetry media. In the recovered recording, the exchange is brief but chillingly clear. Merritt, Channel A, Houston, confirmed checklist, 0.81. Response, Channel B. Already confirmed, Alan. Don't forget the reflection, don't lose it this time. No one knew what the reflection referred to. For those within NASA, unexplained radio anomalies were not unheard of. During Apollo 10, astronauts Stafford and Young reported strange musical sounds on the far side of the moon, later attributed to interference between VHF channels. But Merritt's case was different. The language, timing, and cadence were too deliberate. Linguistic analysis conducted years later by researchers at Purdue University found that the modulation drift in both voices matched precisely, as if recorded by the same human throat under identical atmospheric conditions. Outside official circles, the story gained little traction. Most references were buried in internal bulletins and archival footnotes. Only after the 1997 digital transfer of NASA's analog audio did fragments of the tape circulate among enthusiasts, reigniting interest in the so-called temporal loop transmission. Amateur analysts reconstructed the waveform and identified microscopic variations, minute inconsistencies in magnetization, that hinted at two distinct recording sessions separated by years, somehow merged onto a single reel. There were other oddities. During Merritt's actual lunar mission, Apollo 19's telemetry logs record a 21-second blackout while the crew orbited the moon's far side. When the feed returned, Merritt's voice was steady but altered in tone. His post-mission psychological evaluation noted mild disorientation and subjective time compression, though he passed all cognitive assessments. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Carter, later recalled that Merritt had spent the remainder of the flight gazing through the command module window, whispering what sounded like his own call sign repeatedly. By the late 1970s, Merritt withdrew from public appearances. He taught orbital mechanics at Purdue and refused all interview requests. Students described him as kind yet distant, prone to long silences when discussing temporal calculations or signal latency. In one lecture, captured in a surviving audio reel, he made an offhand remark that still puzzles researchers. If a message travels far enough, it might return not from where you sent it, but from when. Modern physicists have occasionally revisited the case through the lens of time dilation and signal reflection. While general relativity allows for theoretical distortions of time near massive gravitational fields, no evidence suggests a radio wave could transmit backward in time under lunar conditions. Nevertheless, the combination of magnetic tape aging, environmental noise, and unknown interference patterns continues to elude complete explanation. A 2008 MIT review proposed that the anomaly may have arisen from a reversed polarity error during tape duplication. Yet when technicians attempted to reproduce the effect under identical conditions, the result was only static. In recent years, the preserved reel, catalogued as T102 Apollo 19 SIM, was digitized and analyzed using voice synthesis mapping. The AI models confirmed a 100% match between the two voices in Merritt's later interviews, down to micro-intonation patterns. Strangely, Even the tremor in the recording corresponds with a neurological condition Merritt did not develop until his 70s. To acoustic engineers, it suggested that one of the voices was recorded decades after the other, yet both existed simultaneously on a tape from 1969. Among historians of spaceflight, Merritt's file remains a curiosity, a collision of human precision and technological uncertainty. His logbooks, still archived in Houston, contain marginal notes written in tight script, including a line that many consider a private reflection on the incident. "If I ever hear myself again, I hope I listen this time. In the silent expanse beyond Earth's pull, a man once claimed to have heard his own voice calling from a future he would never reach. The sailor who crossed yesterday's horizon." No place tests the measure of time like the open sea. Beyond the reach of land, where the stars are both compass and witness, time stretches and folds with the rhythm of the tide. To sailors of the 19th century, days were not counted by clocks but by the rising and setting of the sun across an endless horizon that seemed to both beckon and deceive. The difference between a single degree of longitude could shift an entire day's reckoning, and for those who sailed the Pacific in its uncharted breadth, there were nights when the world itself appeared to pause. The ship was the HMS Resolute, a bark of oak and iron that departed from Portsmouth in the summer of 1854. She was bound for the Pacific via Cape Horn, carrying navigational equipment newly issued by the British Admiralty and a crew trained in the meticulous art of celestial observation. Among them was Lieutenant Henry Alden, a quiet navigator whose journals later became the centre of one of maritime history's most curious legends. His task was simple: to keep perfect time, to align the ship's course with the stars, and to record each passing day in a logbook designed to make sense of the world's shifting seas. By the 5th week, the crew had begun to notice that the sun's arc no longer matched their chronometers. Noon arrived too early, and twilight lingered longer than expected. Alden adjusted the ship's clocks and recalculated their position against the constellations of the southern hemisphere. Yet even after correction, the dates no longer matched their location. According to his log, they were sailing east, but the sky itself suggested they were heading backward. The ship's shadow stretched west across the waves as if resisting its own voyage. At night, the navigator's logs grew contradictory. The chronometer, wound precisely at dawn, recorded hours that did not align with the stars. On one page, Alden noted that the date was Tuesday, while the barometer and sextant readings corresponded to the sky of Monday. The ship's carpenter, checking his tools by lamplight, found a pocket watch that had stopped at the same moment every evening, only to begin again after midnight. When the captain compared the logs, he found that 2 separate records existed for the same day, each written in Alden's hand, each identical except for the position of the ship. Maritime historians later examined the records preserved in the Admiralty archives. The Resolute's last confirmed signal was received near the Line Islands, transmitted by Morse lamp to a passing merchant vessel. The message reported unusual chronometric drift and requested verification of the current date. That vessel, the Caledonia, recorded the time as July 28, 1854. But when the Resolute's signal reached a relay station in Honolulu days later, the report bore a different timestamp, July 27. The discrepancy was dismissed as an operator's error until further correspondence revealed that the Resolute had logged its position east of where it should have been, as if it had travelled against the Earth's rotation. One explanation proposed that the Resolute had sailed across a rare magnetic anomaly near what would later become the International Date Line. In the mid-19th century, global navigation was an evolving science, and magnetic variation charts were still incomplete. The region near the 180th meridian was notorious for confusing compasses, where local fields shifted unpredictably under the influence of the Pacific's tectonic ridges. Explorers of the era often reported wandering needles and drifting stars, phenomena attributed to auroral interference or solar storms. If the Resolute had entered such a zone during the July voyage, it might explain the navigational confusion, but not the duplicate days found in Alden's journal. Yet survivor accounts tell a quieter story, written not in charts but in memory. A deckhand named Samuel Ward, found adrift weeks later and rescued by a whaling vessel, described a dawn that rose twice. His testimony, recorded in Sydney in 1855, told of the sea turning like glass, and the air falling still as though sound itself had been suspended. He claimed the crew had celebrated crossing the meridian one evening, marking the new date by firing the ship's signal gun. But at sunrise, the same date appeared again in the log, and the captain ordered it to remain unaltered until they could confirm the truth. Ward never saw the Resolute again. By the time his rescue reached port, no record of the ship's existence could be verified beyond that single set of duplicated coordinates. Historians who revisited the case in the 20th century approached it as a study of early navigational error. Oceanographers cited the 1854 Magnetic Survey of the Pacific, which identified irregularities near the Caroline Islands capable of disorienting even seasoned crews. Others noted that the Resolute was not a name unique to one ship. Several vessels bore it during the mid-century expansion of the Royal Navy, suggesting a simple clerical overlap. But those who examined the preserved fragments of Alden's log, the handwriting pressed deep into the paper, the ink blotted by damp air, pointed to an unaccountable detail. The final entry bore a weather report dated July 28th, yet the following page began again with the heading, July 27th, latitude confirmed. Long after the ship's timbers vanished into the Pacific currents, sailors still spoke of the day that came twice. In maritime folklore, the horizon is more than a line of sight. It is a boundary between knowing and forgetting. Some claim that time, when crossed at just the right angle, can turn back on itself like a tide. The Resolute, they said, had not been lost but delayed, caught between one revolution of the Earth and the next, endlessly repeating a single day beneath a sky that refused to change. A ship once sailed beneath an unmoving sky, venturing past time's horizon and returning to a world already prepared for its return. The stranger who predicted his own funeral. London's fog was not made of smoke alone. It carried soot, ash, and the memory of breath, curling through the narrow alleys where gas lamps burned without warmth. In the late Victorian years, the city's quiet was deceptive. Beneath its cobblestone streets lay catacombs of ledgers and graves, the records of a society obsessed with order even in death. Among the hundreds of thousands of names entered into parish logs and municipal archives, one case stands apart, preserved not for its crime or scandal, but for the single impossible question that preceded it. The man first appeared at the gates of Kensal Green Cemetery on an evening in 1891. The caretaker, accustomed to mourners and gravediggers alike, noted the hour precisely, 7:30, when the lamps were just being lit and the last of the day's processions had ended. The visitor was neither young nor old, dressed in a black overcoat that had not yet gathered dust. He carried a folded document under his arm and asked, with a calm that seemed rehearsed, whether he might see the burial register for the coming week. When told such records were reserved for the clergy, he offered a small sum in exchange for a name to be added. Witnesses described him as pale, well-dressed, and unusually certain of his purpose. He gave his name as Thomas Hargreaves of Bloomsbury and recited a date for his interment, 3 days ahead. The sexton, thinking it a morbid jest, refused at first, but the man insisted that the paperwork be completed in advance. He dictated the time of the funeral, the number of mourners, and even requested a particular hymnal to be sung. When asked who was to provide the coffin, Hargreaves replied that it had already been arranged, by myself. The entry was made reluctantly in the ledger's margin, marked with the note to verify. What unsettled the sexton was not the man's composure, but the way he seemed to recognise every corner of the grounds. He paused before a particular row of headstones and stood silent for several minutes, as though confirming a memory. When questioned, he simply said, "It looks smaller than I remember." The caretaker assumed he was a mourner recalling an earlier burial. But before leaving, Hargreaves turned once more to the registry, pressed his signature below the blank entry, and stated with faint politeness, "It is important that this remains unchanged." He was seen crossing the gate's threshold at dusk, disappearing into the deepening fog along Harrow Road. When his body was later brought to the same cemetery 3 days afterward, the record was filed without annotation. The cause of death was recorded as sudden heart failure, witnessed by 2 neighbours who found him collapsed beside his lodgings in Russell Square. The date matched the one he had given. According to the undertaker's notes, the man carried no personal effects except for a single card bearing his own name and the words, "Kensal Green, October 17th. No relatives came forward to claim the remains, though the funeral proceeded as scheduled, attended by a small assembly of cemetery staff who remembered his earlier visit. The coroner's report, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, lists the details with bureaucratic precision. Height, 5 feet 10, age, approximately 40. No sign of struggle or intoxication. The handwriting on the witness statement, his signature from the earlier visit, was compared against the burial record. They were identical, down to the slope of the final S. The coroner remarked on the coincidence, but noted that the ink used on the cemetery form predated the man's death by several days. The entry was sealed, later transferred to the city's growing collection of unexplained fatalities filed between 1880 and 1900. Historians who revisited the case a century later found the records intact, the handwriting still legible, though the paper had browned at its edges. They noted a peculiarity. Both signatures had been made with the same iron gall ink mixture used exclusively by the cemetery office, suggesting that Hargreaves had signed his own posthumous entry, using their pen before his death. Forensic analysis of the handwriting in 1972 confirmed that the two samples could not be distinguished. Yet no evidence of forgery or clerical error was found, and no alternate identity for Thomas Hargreaves was discovered in parish rolls or census documents of the period. Some researchers link the case to the Victorian fascination with foreknowledge, a time when spiritualism, mesmerism, and emerging theories of the subconscious blurred the line between science and the supernatural. Newspapers of the 1890s were filled with reports of prophetic dreams, death omens, and experiments in hypnotic suggestion. In 1889, a Cambridge scholar named Frederick Myers published studies on telepathic premonition, arguing that the mind might perceive its own future state under certain emotional conditions. The Hargreaves incident, reprinted decades later in the Journal of Psychical Research, was cited as a possible instance of such temporal displacement, though no conclusion was reached. Others viewed it as a failure of record-keeping, a byproduct of the era's administrative overload. The London Burial Act of 1852 had led to new metropolitan cemeteries like Kensal Green, where paperwork often lagged behind events. Clerks working by lamplight could easily misstate entries or transpose signatures between ledgers. Skeptics suggested that Hargreaves might have been mistaken for another man of a similar name, or that his visit had occurred after, not before, his death was officially registered. Yet no duplicate record exists under any variation of his name, and no evidence suggests the entry was amended posthumously. By the early 20th century, the event had passed into quiet folklore. Gravediggers told it as a warning to those who tempted fate by walking the cemetery after dusk. A 1923 article in the Evening Standard titled "The Man Who Booked His Own Grave" revived the story briefly, adding fictional embellishments of séance messages and spectral appearances, though the core details remained verifiable. Later scholars stripped these myths away, returning to the simple factual sequence. A man requested his own funeral date, signed his own register, and died precisely when he said he would. Yet the handwriting remains perfectly matched on two documents filed days apart, one signed by the living, the other by the dead. Even now, the page lies in the Metropolitan Archives under the heading Unclassified Case number 74, its ink faded but unaltered. To anyone who studies it closely, the signature seems to carry no tremor of hesitation, just the smooth assurance of a man writing what he already knew. In the city that forgets no name, one man left his twice, each written on the same day in the same hand. Highway looping back in time. In the expanse between two desert towns, where the road straightens for nearly 40 miles, the horizon can play tricks even on the most disciplined traveller. The air above the asphalt shimmers like molten glass, and mirages of distant vehicles blur into heat. Long-distance drivers call this stretch of Highway 318 the Straight Line, a corridor of silence between the edges of Nevada's Great Basin. By daylight, it is a passage of motionless earth and unbroken sky. By night, it becomes a kind of nowhere, where headlights pierce the dark and the concept of distance begins to unravel. The incident entered State Patrol logs on a warm night in 1972, when a driver named Harold Fincher radioed that his route had begun to repeat. Fincher, a hauler for the Western Freight Line, had left Ely at 10:14 p.m. carrying industrial solvents bound for Tonopah. According to dispatch records, he reported passing the same highway marker twice within an hour, even though his fuel and odometer suggested no turn or detour. The patrol car sent to locate him never made visual contact, but at 12:07 a.m, Fincher's voice returned over the CB, calm but certain. He said he had seen his own truck ahead of him on the same road, travelling at the same speed. Fincher's logbook, recovered later from his glove compartment, recorded mileage and fuel data that contradicted the patrol's radar archives by nearly an hour. The handwriting remained steady, his timestamps exact, but the entries described a sequence of locations that overlapped. When the rig was finally located at dawn, it was parked just north of the Nye County line with the engine idling and the driver asleep in the cab. He told investigators he remembered driving through the same stretch twice, even recognizing the same cigarette stub burning on the roadside shoulder. The Nevada Department of Transportation's investigators first classified it as an instrumentation fault, noting how early analog odometers often drifted when exposed to high temperatures. The official report cited mechanical lag due to thermal expansion, a phrase that explained everything except the missing hour. The department's memo filed that August noted the possibility of driver fatigue and mirage distortion, common to late-night routes, yet Fincher had passed a medical and psychological evaluation only 2 weeks earlier. No disciplinary action was taken, and the case was closed quietly under driver misperception. Yet similar reports began to surface within months, truckers describing the same stretch of asphalt, the same signage, looping past them twice in a single journey. A Greyhound bus driver logged an identical experience, claiming the digital clock above his dashboard had reset to the previous hour just as the same billboard appeared again. Another account, from a pair of surveyors travelling southbound, mentioned the same roadside marker appearing at intervals inconsistent with speed or terrain. None of them turned back. All continued driving until the route returned to normal. What complicated the inquiry was the absence of temporal markers. Wristwatches lagged behind dashboard clocks, and CB radio transmissions echoed seconds after ending. Patrol officers noted hearing duplicated broadcasts, as though the signal had reflected off something unseen. Amateur radio operators in the area later claimed to pick up repeating fragments of Fincher's original 1972 transmission well into the decade, replaying across frequencies that should have gone silent. The notion of the desert as a mirror, reflecting sound, light, and perhaps time itself, began to circulate among drivers as an unspoken superstition. By 1975, transportation engineers installed mile markers at quarter-mile intervals, hoping to measure travel patterns more precisely along the affected segment. Each sign was embedded with reflective strips to ensure visual consistency. Motion sensors were placed in culverts, synchronized with infrared counters to detect passing vehicles. The project, known internally as the Temporal Loop Survey, lasted only 7 months before being discontinued. Funding was withdrawn after sensors began producing overlapping timestamps, recording the same vehicle number twice within a 2-minute frame. Engineers blamed data interference from electrical storms, though the weather reports showed clear skies for all but one of those nights. Data from those years shows vehicles passing the same coordinates twice without crossing a U-turn radius, a geometric impossibility that was quietly archived. When the files were later reviewed, discrepancies appeared in the transmission headers themselves, records dated and signed on days that had not yet arrived. No public explanation was offered. The Transportation Data Archive lists those entries now as incomplete data sets, though each file remains timestamped to a specific second. For years afterward, drivers continued to describe the strange dislocation, the same radio song restarting, the same roadkill reappearing, the same curve unfolding as though filmed once and replayed again. Locals spoke of the road as cursed, though the term used in official memoranda was spatial reorientation anomaly, a phrase that appeared once and never again. In nearby towns, diner owners remembered travellers arriving twice in the same evening, ordering the same meal as if the first encounter had not occurred. A mechanic in Lund swore he'd serviced the same fuel truck on consecutive mornings, identical in wear, odometer, and driver fatigue. When he called the company's regional office to confirm, they claimed no such visit had been logged at all. Such stories never reached newspapers, but circulated quietly among the people who lived along the straight line. Today, satellite imaging of the area shows no structural irregularities, yet the pattern of disappearances continues, unmapped, unacknowledged, and still under review. Modern GPS trackers, when tested along the route, have occasionally displayed a brief, inexplicable stasis. Position frozen, then restored a minute later without deviation. Even dash cams reveal footage skipping backward by a few seconds, frames overlapping in a rhythm no software fault has yet reproduced. Engineers attribute it to signal reflection between plateaus, though none can replicate it under controlled conditions. To this day, drivers approach that section of highway with quiet respect. Many keep a second clock taped to the dash, a tradition born not from folklore but from habit, a way of watching for the minute that might slip. Others, recalling Fincher's account, never travel alone after midnight. For those who've driven it, the stretch is more than pavement and heat. It is a corridor where the ordinary progression of time thins, where motion itself seems to echo. On that endless stretch of asphalt, the clock's second hand is still turning in reverse. Photograph that aged in reverse. In a cedar box lined with felt, a family photograph began to move backward through time. The box sat for decades on the top shelf of a quiet farmhouse in Vermont, surrounded by letters, birth records, and the dust of uncounted winters. Its owner, Margaret Klein, had inherited it from her mother, who had always insisted that the photograph inside looked younger each year. At first, the claim seemed sentimental, the kind of thing one says about old memories refusing to fade. But when Margaret lifted the lid in 1978, she noticed the garden behind the figures looked brighter than she remembered, and the man in the frame stood taller, his posture unbent by the years. The image, developed in 1959 on Kodachrome film, showed 3 people standing in a garden that no longer exists. It had been taken outside the family's home in Middlebury, one of the early suburban plots that later gave way to a paved highway interchange. Kodachrome, a film introduced in the 1930s and praised for its colour stability, was designed to resist fading for over a century. Yet the Klein photograph seemed to reject that principle altogether. The colours were not fading but reversing, the hues growing more vivid as if freshly developed. The edges, where exposure should have caused yellowing, had regained their original clarity. It was as though the photograph was undeveloping itself, moving in slow retreat from the moment it had captured. By the late 1970s, the figures in the print had begun to change, the older woman's hair darkening each year instead of fading. Family members kept it on the mantle, taking new snapshots every few months to compare its transformation. The process was subtle, so gradual that visitors doubted anything unusual was happening. Yet, when the oldest daughter, Helen, returned after 5 years abroad, she pointed out what others had ignored. Her grandmother's wrinkles were gone, and the shadows beneath her eyes had softened. Soon, the man beside her seemed younger too, his suit less worn, his expression less tired. By 1982, the child in the photograph, once 8 years old, appeared no older than 4. Photographic conservators at the George Eastman Museum were the first to examine the print under magnification. They had been contacted after a local newspaper ran a feature calling it "The Picture That Refuses to Age." The museum's lab, known for its meticulous preservation of analogue film, requested the image for study, suspecting a case of chemical restoration caused by environmental factors. Under a Zeiss stereo microscope, they found no evidence of bleaching, retouching, or artificial repair. Instead, the dye layers were found to be reconstituting from the substrate upward, a process that, in known chemistry, could only occur if the film's molecular structure was reversing oxidation itself. Their findings described a reversal of chemical oxidation in the film's silver halide layers, a process never documented outside controlled laboratory conditions. Kodachrome's dye couplers were designed to be stable, bonded irreversibly during development. For them to separate in such a precise and chronological pattern would require an external energy input, something akin to time-dependent radiation exposure or inverted light decay. Yet none of the spectral readings showed abnormal interference. A 1980 report by Eastman's conservation team noted, in restrained technical language, that the degradation pattern appears to correspond inversely to the photograph's original exposure sequence. In effect, the image was travelling backward through its own history. To the family, the explanation meant little. They simply noticed that the child in the image was now younger than their grandchildren. They continued to visit the farmhouse on holidays, opening the cedar box like a relic of quiet dread. Margaret Klein eventually stopped showing the photograph to guests. She claimed that the child's face, once smiling, had grown solemn, then faint, as if she were slipping into a place where she no longer belonged. When asked about it years later, she said she felt an inexplicable sadness every time she looked at the print, as though it were remembering something the living could not. Archival correspondence from 1984 shows that the print was eventually transferred to a humidity-controlled vault at the Smithsonian's Preservation Lab. The move came after the Eastman Museum recommended federal storage, citing the photograph's unique and potentially unstable photochemical behavior. Smithsonian curators, cautious of public speculation, labeled the item under an anonymous accession number. The chain of custody lists half a dozen technicians who examined the print over the next decade, each adding small notations about temperature fluctuations and minute shifts in color density. None of them agreed on what was happening, but all observed that the regression continued unaffected by isolation or light control. Technicians recorded further regression, clothing shifting to earlier fashions, plants reverting to seedlings, and objects in the background vanishing entirely. By 1988, the garden fence had shortened, the wooden posts looked freshly cut. The child's toy, a red ball, appeared translucent, then disappeared altogether. When the image was scanned on high-resolution film, the analysis software detected faint traces of previous exposure patterns emerging from beneath the visible surface, suggesting that even earlier states of the photograph were reasserting themselves. To observers, it was as if the photograph had memory, its layers peeling backward toward an origin that predated its own creation. By 1999, only a faint outline of a child remained, the rest of the frame silvered over like a mirror. What was left reflected the face of whoever looked into it, though the reflection appeared slightly delayed, as if seen through a fraction of lost time. Visitors described a subtle distortion, an echo of light that trembled at the edge of visibility. The Smithsonian report from that year lists the print as chemically exhausted, yet the metadata notes an anomaly, a persistent reverse shift in emulsion density measurable under ultraviolet scanning. The photograph, in official terms, had become its own negative. In the Smithsonian's catalogue, the photograph is still marked stable, even as annual reviews observe a subtle one-way shift, backward through time. The entry is dated, indexed, and sealed under a case marked non-circulating. Those who have seen it say the child's outline is still present, fainter now, reduced to a faint ghost of silver. When preservation scientists attempt to replicate the effect, they find no physical process that can account for the regression. It is as though the print itself were caught in an inverse current of time, quietly undoing the moment it was made, each atom of image recalling a light that has already gone out. Under the sheen of glass, time stirs, remembering what once slipped beyond its grasp. Clock tower that ran backward. The first sign of failure came not in sound but in silence, when the pendulum ceased its swing between the two marks of noon. For the span of a single breath, the tower seemed to hold still above the harbour, its shadow suspended over cobblestone and tide. Then, as the crowd below began to sense something wrong, the minute hand shivered once and began to retreat. Each backward movement was deliberate, smooth, and precise, as if time had simply found a more efficient route back to where it had come from. Inside the brass casing, gears that should have resisted motion began to unwind in perfect rhythm, their teeth catching against time itself. The tower's interior, darkened by centuries of dust and oil, trembled with a soft metallic pulse. Not the strike of malfunction, but the rhythm of something rehearsed. Those who later studied the mechanism would note that there was no grinding, no fracture, and no human interference. It was as though the clock, having served faithfully for generations, had chosen to resume a former state that no one had recorded. Records kept by municipal engineers describe how, at precisely 12:03, the minute hand began to travel backward while maintaining a flawless beat. The tower's chronometer, powered by counterweights and a pendulum, had never before deviated by more than a few seconds a month. Every entry in its maintenance log since 1894 testified to its stability, until that noon when the keeper on duty, Aaron Voss, wrote in his ledger that the mechanism appeared obedient but facing the wrong direction. Voss was a cautious man, employed by the Municipal Office of Stavern, and his report remains one of the few written accounts that treat the event as purely observational. Only later did reports identify the structure as the old clock tower of Stavoren, a 17th century maritime installation long regarded as a symbol of precision. The tower had guided ships through the Frisian fogs and signalled to the harbour workers the arrival and departure of merchant fleets. Its design followed the Flemish school of tower construction, a bell cage resting atop an octagonal shaft, the dial turned toward the sea. Its maker, Jan van der Heide, was known for the calibration of astronomical clocks, and his name still appears in guild records from 1668. Such precision had earned the clock its reputation as the town's most reliable measure of order, until the day that order bent inward upon itself. Local maintenance crews attributed the reversal to voltage fluctuation from nearby telegraph lines, an explanation that satisfied no one who heard the clock's tone change. When the bell struck noon again, it did not echo upward but descended, its notes falling in reverse progression like a melody collapsing into silence. For some in the harbour square, the air itself seemed to thicken. A few reported that the gulls wheeled lower over the water, moving against the wind, though none could later prove it. Those gathered near the harbour swore the bell tolled backward, 12 descending notes unravelling the hour. Shopkeepers left their counters to watch the hands retreat through the dial's face. Sailors on moored vessels counted the strikes and found them inconsistent with any known chime pattern. When the sound finally ceased, the square fell into an uneasy quiet that lasted until the following tide. By then, the clock had reversed nearly 7 full minutes. When the mechanism was disassembled the following day, the escapement wheel showed reversed abrasion, wear marks polished along the side opposite natural motion. Engineers photographed the gear train, noting no warping or loosened pivots. The anchor verge had moved counterclockwise without resistance, and the pendulum's arc displayed symmetrical soot marks on either side of its path. In short, the tower had functioned flawlessly while defying its own purpose. The report concluded that no ordinary stress could have produced such a reversal without visible damage. A report from the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute noted a simultaneous fluctuation in magnetic readings across the IJsselmeer coast, lasting exactly 6 minutes. The anomaly was minor, but it aligned precisely with the recorded time of the reversal. In the years since, researchers have compared it to short-lived geomagnetic disturbances observed during solar storms, most notably the event of the 13th of March 1989 that disrupted power grids across Canada. Yet no major solar activity was reported on the day the Stavern clock turned back. Whatever interference had reached the tower's mechanism was isolated, local, and unrepeatable. After the event, townspeople adjusted their watches by instinct, though none could agree on how much time had been lost or gained. Shop owners claimed deliveries arrived before they were sent. Train conductors swore the afternoon schedule advanced itself. Even in the following weeks, routine tasks seemed slightly displaced, as if cause and effect had traded sequence. The town's mayor ordered the clock stopped for recalibration, but work was delayed when every attempt to synchronise it with railway time failed by several seconds in alternating directions. By the time restoration experts arrived decades later, the clock's interior still bore alignment marks that ran counter to gravity, as if the mechanism had remembered its own reversal. Layers of oil hardened into crescent streaks on the pendulum housing, frozen in a pattern suggesting upward flow. The specialists drawn from the Dutch Society for the Preservation of Historical Timepieces concluded that the structure had endured no external tampering. The only alteration they noted was conceptual, a design repurposed by circumstance. Now sealed for preservation, the tower is said to carry a faint rhythmic pulse, an echo that climbs the stone from a pendulum no one has seen in years. On certain calm evenings, when the harbour air settles and the water mirrors the sky, the dial's reflection appears to turn the opposite way. The restoration crew attributes this to an optical illusion, the product of rippling light against the tower's surface. Yet locals still pause when the bell tolls, unsure whether the sound marks the present or an hour already spent. Some claim the tower no longer measures time at all, only the distance between what once was and what insists on happening again. Miner who found his past self. The shift bell had not yet sounded when the first crew descended into the Nordermere shaft, a mine whose tunnels cut deep into the Carboniferous seams beneath Limburg. The coalfield had operated since the late 19th century, part of the Netherlands' post-war industrial recovery, its galleries mapped like veins beneath the soil. Above ground, the air carried the faint scent of sulphur and smoke from the processing plants, but below, the atmosphere was damp, heavy and still, where sound travelled slowly and light seemed to stop at the edges of the beam. It was a place where time was measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of picks against rock. At the third level, where the air grew warmer and the walls glistened with moisture, a miner named Willem de Wit struck his pick against a wall that rang like glass. He was 34 years old, a man who had worked underground since adolescence, accustomed to the quiet groan of the earth and the shuddering machinery that kept it open. The noise that followed was not like a crack or collapse, but something sharper, a hollow tone that made the others pause. When the dust settled, the light from their lamps fell on what appeared to be a human figure partially embedded in the coalface, the shape of an arm protruding just enough to reflect the dull gleam of metal. The surface foreman's report, dated the 17th of November 1961, records an interruption in production after de Wit called for assistance, claiming to have found a body wedged in a rock face. The wording of the entry remains unusually terse. Specimen human origin, extraction halted, request inspectorate presence. Within hours, state officials arrived, sealing off the shaft and ordering a full inspection of the gallery. For the miners who waited above, the event spread through the town by morning. Another fatality, they assumed, a man trapped in a forgotten drift from an earlier era. What none expected was that the body bore not the marks of decay, but of reflection. What unsettled investigators was not the presence of the body, but its familiarity. The man's face, clothes and tools matched de Wit's own. The corpse appeared identical down to the smallest detail. The company-issued overalls, the stitched initials on the breast pocket, even the dent in the left side of his helmet. De Wit's identification tag, numbered 4312, hung from his belt. The body's tag bore the same engraving. According to testimony taken later that week, de Wit collapsed upon seeing it, insisting that his own tag had never left his person. The mine physician recorded his pulse at 140 and noted that his skin was ashen and clammy, consistent with shock. In the days that followed, both men, one living, one recovered, were measured, photographed and fingerprinted under the supervision of the Dutch State Mines Inspectorate. Fingerprint analysis, conducted in The Hague, confirmed a perfect match across all 10 impressions. The authorities ordered complete confidentiality, classifying the incident as an occupational anomaly. De Wit was temporarily reassigned to surface duties while the lower chamber was cordoned off with steel sheeting. It was rumoured among workers that the duplicate body had been transferred to a medical facility in Utrecht, though no record of such a transfer exists. Lab technicians from Utrecht noted that the tissues of the recovered body displayed no decomposition, yet radiocarbon testing placed the remains several decades older than de Wit himself. The readings indicated a date range consistent with the 1920s, though the fabric of the clothing and the model of the mining lamp corresponded exactly to the equipment issued in 1961. Inconsistent results also appeared in the enamel of the teeth, where isotopic values suggested long-term exposure to air levels no longer found in post-war Europe. The report concluded that the sample represented anomalous carbon fixation of unknown cause, recommending further geochronological study that was never undertaken. Geologists examining the stratum reported that the surrounding rock had not been disturbed in at least 50 years, its layers compressed and unbroken. The chamber's walls bore no sign of intrusion, no seams or fractures consistent with burial or entry. Microscopic analysis revealed a fine sheen of mineral accretion over the clothing, as though the fabric had formed part of the rock itself. Some of the more superstitious miners said the body must have grown there, that the earth had formed it from memory. But the engineers kept to their measurements, unwilling to name what they could not quantify. De Wit was questioned repeatedly about relatives, records or twins, but none existed. His employment file, birth certificate and wartime registration all pointed to a single individual. Investigators even traced his family line back to 19th century parish archives in Maastricht, confirming no other branch shared his birth date or likeness. When asked if he'd ever been photographed underground, he replied that he had not. The inspector's notes from that interview end with a pencil line. Subject appears detached from event, avoids discussion of mirrored identity. Colleagues recalled that after the discovery, DeWitt avoided the lower tunnels, insisting that the air below breathed backward, a phrase later entered in the foreman's notes. He began working shorter shifts, claiming he could hear the echo of picks before they struck the wall. Once, during a maintenance inspection, another miner claimed to see a light deep within the sealed chamber, faint and pulsing as though reflected through water. When they returned with instruments to verify it, the glow was gone. Within a year, DeWitt left the company and relocated to Belgium, taking up work as a dockhand. He never spoke publicly of the incident again. When the mine closed in 1974, the chamber where the body had been found was sealed under concrete, its coordinates stricken from public maps. The closure came as part of the national deindustrialization program that ended coal production across the Limburg Basin. Officially, the section was listed as unstable due to methane seepage, though retired inspectors later stated that no such hazard had been recorded there. A memorandum filed that year referred cryptically to containment of unresolved specimen. The pages that follow in the archive are missing, replaced by a blank spacer sheet. In archival requests held at Heerlen today, the file remains classified, yet a fragment notes a quartz sample stamped with two identical thumbprints side by side. The note describes them as parallel impressions at impossible angle of incidence, implying they had been made simultaneously from opposing directions. Modern scans of the quartz still show faint ridges preserved within the mineral, sealed under layers of carbonized dust. The Nordermeer shaft itself lies flooded and inaccessible, the steel elevator long rusted, the surface vent buried beneath weeds and gravel. Darkness swallows him, the layers of coal above and memory around as he waits with a breath repeated. Journal that writes ahead of time. It was the faint smear of blue ink along the margin that first suggested the journal knew what the future held. Samuel Crewe, a journalist in London during the spring of 1912, noticed it while leafing through his desk-bound notebook, checking notes for an editorial on municipal sanitation. The smear did not correspond to any known event in the day prior, yet as he read the line aloud to a colleague, it described a minor accident at the corner of Guildford Street that had not yet occurred. Crewe initially dismissed it as a coincidence, the product of memory or misreading, but the precision of the description, the overturned cart, the driver's coat, the collision with a lamppost, was too exact to ignore. Bound in calfskin with gilt edges, the notebook had been purchased from a London stationer in 1912, a period when daily diaries were common among journalists and clerics. Each page bore subtle watermarks indicating paper produced by J. Watman and Sons, known for their high-quality rags and consistent texture. Crewe's habit of noting every meeting, conversation and passing observation made the journal a meticulous record of ordinary life. Yet it was precisely this ordinariness that lent the anomalous entries their weight. The impossible predictions were embedded in the mundane. The first entry to raise concern described a minor fire at the corner of Guildford Street, precisely matching an event reported 3 days later in the Surrey Times. Crewe compared the words, noting that even the phrasing matched. A small blaze, extinguished without injury, chimney stack slightly damaged. It was impossible, he thought, that he could have seen the event before it occurred. He searched local records and confirmed the date in the newspaper archive. The incident had happened exactly as written, on the date the journal had indicated before it transpired. Archivists at the British Library later noted that the ink was composed of Prussian blue pigments, consistent with early 20th century manufacture, and showed no signs of later contamination. Chemical analysis revealed no additions or retouching that might have altered the entries, nor did ultraviolet and infrared scans detect alterations. The pen strokes remained continuous and consistent with Crewe's known handwriting, suggesting the journal had not been modified post facto. These findings lent scientific weight to the anomaly, though they did not explain it. Patterns became undeniable when the journal recorded weather shifts, railway delays and stock prices hours before they appeared in newspapers or ledgers. Crewe's notes on the Thames fog coincided almost perfectly with meteorological bulletins issued the following morning. Railway dispatches, obtained independently from the Great Western and Southern Rail archives, confirmed delays at stations named in entries that predated official reports by several hours. Even commodity prices, later confirmed in the London Stock Exchange records, matched figures inscribed days in advance. The pattern was not isolated. It repeated with a consistency that could not be attributed to coincidence. The writer, Samuel Crewe, confided in colleagues that he could not explain how he'd anticipated conversations, letters, or arrivals in advance, writing only what came unbidden. A friend noted in a letter that Crewe often paused mid-sentence, pen suspended, listening for some internal cue he could not name. He admitted that he never planned his predictions. They arrived as if whispered by some unseen observer. Yet Crewe remained rational, insisting on corroborating each entry with a factual check before acknowledging it had any value, documenting in meticulous detail what others might have dismissed. By 1920, the notebook had been placed in acid-free folders within a humidity-controlled cabinet, alongside correspondence detailing its peculiar predictive qualities. Archivists noted that the journal's storage conditions, consistent temperature around 18 degrees Celsius, relative humidity at 45%, preserved both ink and paper without visible deterioration. Crewe himself had donated a typed index of the anomalous entries, cross-referenced against public records, emphasising that the phenomenon could not be repeated or studied outside the confines of the journal. Institutional measures ensured the artefact's longevity, but they also insulated it from public scrutiny. Technicians analysing the text under ultraviolet light observed no overwriting or erasure, yet every line corresponded to events that would unfold after the date inscribed. Minute abrasions on the paper's surface showed ordinary wear, yet microscopic inspection revealed no indication of posthumous inscription. Every stroke of the quill, every indentation, aligned perfectly with temporal inconsistencies, as though the hand and ink were operating on separate clocks. Scholars speculated on time lag effects, chronoception anomalies, and perceptual displacement, though none provided conclusive reasoning for the observed phenomena. Modern scholars digitizing the collection in 2019 found metadata confirming the journal had never been edited posthumously, preserving its entries exactly as written a century earlier. Scans of the ink strokes and paper fibers allowed forensic comparison with Crewe's other writings. They demonstrated that the anomalies were intrinsic to this single volume. Public reference catalogues describe it only as an object of interest for chronological anomalies, leaving the broader implications unaddressed. Its predictive entries, though verified against historical records, remain as inscrutable now as when first discovered, a silent testament to the intersection of human observation and temporal uncertainty. Despite exhaustive cross-referencing, no natural explanation accounted for the timing, sequence, or specificity of the predicted events, leaving the journal classified as an object of temporal anomaly. Researchers noted its uniqueness. While other diaries might be prophetic in a figurative sense, none contained verifiable events recorded before they occurred, verified across independent sources. Crewe's journal thus stands apart in both factual documentation and narrative resonance, a chronicle of the world that writes ahead of itself. The ink moves forward before the hand, and the world unfolds in its shadow, unreadable until the moment it becomes history. Shipwreck, survivor from the future. The first diver noted a solitary figure clinging to the hull side, bobbing among flotsam while the Atlantic churned beneath the January sky. Waves lapped against the wreckage of a steel vessel, half submerged in the icy water, and the man's breathing, though steady, seemed incongruous with hours spent adrift. The current tugged at the lifeboat scattered around him, and the diver's torch revealed a face pale but unscarred, eyes fixed on some distant horizon. There was an almost imperceptible rhythm in his movements, as if he had rehearsed the act of survival for decades he had not yet lived. The vessel, registered as MV Caledonia, measured 112 metres in length and had sailed from Glasgow to Halifax on the 14th of May 1937. It was a cargo liner of the London and North Eastern Shipping Company, primarily tasked with transporting coal and manufactured goods. According to shipping records, the vessel encountered a sudden nor'easter midway across the North Atlantic, and radio contact was lost shortly after reporting rough seas. Standard maritime charts and weather logs corroborated the timing and location of the sinking, yet none anticipated the appearance of a survivor decades later. Rescue logs from the Canadian Coast Guard detail how the survivor, fully clothed and coherent, was lifted aboard without apparent injury despite exposure to sub-zero water for hours. His coat, gloves and boots were wet but intact, seemingly impervious to the frigid temperature that normally claimed hypothermic victims within minutes. Crew members recorded the event with the formal precision of procedure: weight, approximate duration in water, coordinates of rescue, and the survivor's physical state. No explanation was offered at the time, and the man's calm, detailed account of the sinking perplexed even the most experienced seaman. Identification attempts revealed a striking inconsistency. The man's documentation bore a birth date decades later than the ship's actual voyage. The Canadian authorities contacted British consular officers, who confirmed that the name Thomas Calder belonged to a man born in 1945, 8 years after the Caledonia sank. Fingerprints, when compared to later civil registries, matched the documents, leaving investigators with a contradiction that defied both chronology and reason. The anomaly prompted the case to be filed as suspicious circumstance, though no official theory could account for the temporal disparity. Radiocarbon testing of the life vest, alongside metallurgical analysis of the hull fragments, confirmed the wreck had occurred in 1937, yet the survivor claimed knowledge of events well into the 1960s. Independent labs analysed the steel composition and corrosion patterns, verifying that the vessel had deteriorated over decades exactly in line with historical timelines. Meanwhile, the survivor recounted details of cargo shipments, port arrivals, and maritime inspections that occurred years after the official sinking, creating a precise, factual mismatch between his experience and recorded history. Divers recalled hearing the survivor recite navigational coordinates and cargo manifests that would not have existed at the time of the sinking, yet matched archival shipping records decades later. He named specific hatches, lifeboat drills, and engine room routines, the kind of detail normally accessible only to officers aboard the ship. Subsequent verification with Lloyd's Register of Shipping and local port manifests demonstrated the accuracy of his accounts, deepening the mystery. Crew members noted the eerie precision with which he described not only the vessel's layout, but also events that had yet to transpire from the perspective of 1937. Maritime historians cross-referenced the survivor's statements with Lloyd's Register of Shipping, finding exact agreement with routes, tonnages, and incidents that postdated the wreck by decades. His knowledge encompassed routine maintenance, port inspections, and even the approximate timing of mechanical failures that would occur long after the Caledonia's official disappearance. Scholars documented these correlations meticulously, including exact coordinates and vessel specifications, creating a paper trail that would later form the foundation for archival study and restricted maritime reports. Interviews conducted aboard the rescue vessel noted his calm demeanour and precise recollection, down to the sequence of hatches and lifeboat drills, details impossible for a man who should not yet have existed. Officers and medical staff alike recorded both his physiological responses and behavioural observations. He appeared neither panicked nor disoriented, speaking as though the sinking were not an event experienced, but a set of instructions memorised from some unseen ledger of time. Written logs describe him pacing the deck, tracing the ship's outline with a finger as he narrated the sequence of the storm, seemingly immune to exhaustion. The wreck site, revisited in 2015 using sonar imaging, revealed that the hull had remained remarkably intact in the deep Atlantic mud, preserving the positions of lifeboats and cargo exactly as described by the survivor. Modern scanning techniques, including multi-beam sonar and photogrammetry, confirmed the spatial accuracy of his recollections. Submerged artifacts from coiled mooring lines to cargo containers remained in precise alignment with the survivor's testimony, a convergence of observation and fact that reinforced the temporal enigma. Archaeological teams documented the measurements, comparing historical maps to contemporary sonar plots, each reinforcing the impossibility of his knowledge. Official records from the International Maritime Organization list the survivor as unknown origin, his presence noted but inexplicable, the anomaly archived without public disclosure. Subsequent filings with the Canadian Coast Guard, the British Maritime Authority and Lloyd's Register described the case in strictly neutral terms, emphasising procedural facts and leaving conclusions to speculation. No public announcement was ever made. The event was catalogued among unexplained maritime anomalies, a record maintained in protected archives accessible only to researchers with security clearance. He had sailed a course that no calendar had yet measured, and the ocean remembered him long before history did. Farmer, who spoke to yesterday's harvest. Bending toward the soil, the earliest cornstalks seemed to remember a future season waiting to unfold. Eli Granger, tending the northernmost field of his Hawthorne County farm, paused mid-step, noting the peculiar curvature of the plants. Their tassels, normally pointing skyward in the height of summer, drooped downward, the kernels shrinking subtly, as if unripening in real time. Morning dew reflected light in a way that made the furrows of soil appear to smooth themselves out overnight, erasing footprints and tire marks. Granger rubbed his eyes, convinced the low winter sun was playing tricks, yet the effect persisted into the next day, leaving the farmer to confront a mystery embedded in the earth itself. Hawthorne County, Iowa, with its deep loam and moderate rainfall, had long been known for its predictable planting and harvest cycles. Corn and soybeans dominated the landscape, with average planting beginning in mid-April and harvest occurring between late September and early October. The soil's high organic content supported steady growth, and County Extension Office bulletins provided detailed seasonal guidelines for nitrogen levels, irrigation, and pest management. Granger's farm, spanning nearly 200 acres, followed these recommended practices, with meticulous records kept for crop rotation and yield, making any deviation in growth patterns immediately noticeable. Farmer Eli Granger, accustomed to the rhythm of sowing and reaping, first noticed seedlings curling in reverse while reviewing his planting schedule in early June. The young plants, which should have emerged only a few inches above the soil, displayed fully formed leaves pointing downward toward their roots. Granger recorded the anomaly in a notebook alongside ordinary observations of rainfall and temperature. He compared growth rates with his neighbours' fields, finding no similar regression, and began to suspect that the phenomenon was confined to his land. Extension Office records from 1947 confirm that average corn maturation in the region took 95 to 100 days, yet Granger's journal noted ears fully formed mere weeks after planting. He marked dates meticulously, noting that kernels appeared plump and golden while surrounding crops were still in vegetative stages. Soil moisture readings, temperature logs, and pest inspections suggested normal agricultural conditions, yet the growth patterns contradicted established agronomic data. Local agricultural bulletins emphasized the impossibility of such rapid development without chemical intervention, and Granger could find no explanation in fertilizers, irrigation, or weather anomalies. Neighbors reported seeing plowed fields returning to unbroken soil overnight, an effect that defied both machinery and human intervention. Tractor tracks vanished as though the land had simply undone their passage, and small harvests, previously gathered in sacks, were observed in reverse, with kernels disappearing from cobs and returning to husks. Livestock grazed over areas already harvested, yet the soil beneath remained tilled in sequence as though nothing had changed. Word of these peculiarities spread quietly among the surrounding farms, and a few curious observers visited only to witness the same reversal of growth firsthand. Agricultural scientists later examined soil composition, noting nitrogen levels and microbial activity consistent with a normal growth cycle, yet the plants themselves displayed regressive development. Lab analysis confirmed that the soil contained no unusual compounds, and microscopic inspection of leaves and kernels revealed normal cell structure and chlorophyll content. Photographs of roots and stems showed growth rings that, if interpreted linearly, suggested time itself had folded, producing a sequence of development impossible under conventional biology. Researchers recorded their observations with measured language, emphasizing the factual oddity without speculation on causation. Letters to the local newspaper described the phenomenon with precise dates and measurements, though editors dismissed them as weather-related exaggeration. Granger and a neighbour, both meticulous record keepers, included tables of planting dates, observed regressions, and temperature logs. They noted that while unusual weather patterns could explain minor anomalies, they could not account for the systematic reversal of maturation across multiple crops. The letters, filed with local archives, offer historians a factual record of the initial public awareness of the anomaly, though contemporary readership largely overlooked the reports. Photographs taken with a 1940s box camera show ears of corn at varying stages of maturity along the same row, frozen in a state that should have been temporally impossible. In one image, a young stalk appears to sprout next to a fully formed cob, and a tassel that had browned the day before is now green. Shadows in the photographs confirm the timing of exposure, and negatives archived in the County Historical Society remain remarkably preserved. These visual records, cross-referenced with Granger's journals, reinforce the precision and reality of the anomaly. By 1952, Granger's meticulous logs were transferred to the county archive, catalogued under crop anomalies, and remain available for review by contemporary agronomists. Subsequent researchers noted the consistency of the records, the precision of the photographic evidence, and the absence of any artificial interventions that could explain the temporal distortions. Modern soil analysis, including stratigraphic sampling and radiocarbon testing, confirmed the chronological sequence indicated by the farmer's observations. The earth itself appeared to have reversed small sections of growth, leaving no linear trace. Modern soil scans reveal layers of regressed growth, as though the land itself were folding time back upon itself, leaving no clear line between yesterday and today. Corn, soybeans, and other crops display growth rings and root development that suggest repeated cycles in miniature, each seeming to anticipate or replay the previous day. Researchers using LiDAR imaging and spectral analysis report anomalies confined to Granger's former fields, yet the extent and mechanism remain unexplained. Observers continue to describe a subtle shift in perception when walking among the rows, as if the passage of time itself lingers in the soil, waiting for recognition. In the fields where corn once reached for the sun, the harvest now waits in reverse, patient and unreadable.